Hello and good day, everybody. Welcome to your live event and my office hours today. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Rouxbe, and I'm also one of your chef instructors in the courses. And I'm so happy that you have the time to join me today. And as we take a look at an open forum of questions in the typical open hours, office hours format that you might find in college. And as we get started, I want to mention just a couple of housekeeping items. The first one is, to the best of my ability here, I'd like to have a discussion with you. And, that means that I need your participation to the extent of asking questions that you might have on your mind, and even comments are fine as well, in order to, again, just facilitate the feel, right, of an online discussion. As we think about typing in questions, you can do that in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see a small dialog box that says add question here. Go ahead and type in that question. Please type your questions in complete sentences. It'll allow me to most easily understand your question. And go ahead and send that my way, and it'll enter the queue. And the queue of questions you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. And there's you can see a list of them already. The second item to keep in mind here is that as you look at the questions themselves in the darker gray boxes on the right side, in the upper right-hand corner of each of the question boxes, you'll see a heart-shaped icon. And if you find a question that you particularly like, would like me to address it sooner than later, go ahead and click on that heart icon, and that'll push that question up in the queue. And I will, respond to it a little bit sooner than I would have otherwise. Okay. Without further delay, let's go ahead and jump on into today's questions. And, I will, provide, some sincere feedback based upon my experience and my perspective, both as a professional. Some of this is, of course, going to come from a personal perspective as well. In addition, I'll also add that if I didn't fully answer your question, or if you come up with a question later on, feel free to send it in. And it'll probably make its way to me. And you can send it in to support@rouxbe.com. And I'll be happy to answer those with, as much gusto as I do during the office hours. Okay. And let me add one more item. If you have a particularly technical question, that you want me to maybe dig up some information on, or that could possibly require some digging up of information, it might even be better to send that in via the support@rouxbe.com avenue. That'll give me some time to rustle through my references and give you what turns out to be sometimes a lengthy response. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So to begin, from Carol, what's the process for freezing fresh herbs? Do you wash them first and store them in a Ziploc? How long do they last? I don't use the whole bunch from the grocery store fast enough. Aha. So this is certainly a common scenario. It's something that we experience here at home as well. And so what's the process? I recommend washing them first so that they're ready to use as soon as you pull them out of the freezer, with really no delay, no thawing even necessary at that point. So do clean them first of all. In terms of the way you process or store them, there are some options. If you want to work with the whole herb, then go ahead and put that in a Ziploc bag. That's one way to do it. You can also freeze them on a sheet pan and then place them in a Ziploc bag. It's really 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Your preference between those two. You can certainly pull leaves off of stems, if you want to just isolate the leaves, in which case the same procedure follows. You can either put those in a Ziploc bag or individually quick freeze them on a sheet pan. Keep in mind that if you have smaller pieces, such as individual leaves, especially smaller leaves, say thyme leaves or marjoram leaves, they may have a tendency to clump together, right, when you freeze them together in a Ziploc bag. So, but on the other hand, they also break apart fairly easily. So you can pull off a clump to drop into a pot of soup or stew. So that's often pretty easy to do. Another way to handle the processing is to freeze them in smaller units. And, very often I might find that we have a big bunch of cilantro left, and we'll chop it finely or even puree it, depending on how we might use it later on. And you can freeze that in ice cube trays. So you have little parcels, little flavor packets that you can use to then drop into a dish at whatever stage of cooking is going to be most suitable. Okay, and so those are going to be my suggestions for handling fresh herbs for freezing. All right, thank you. And the next question, can you please direct me to where I can plan and prepare whole food plant-based meals for weight loss? I'm also gluten and dairy sensitive too. I have enjoyed and learned so much from this course. Thank you for all your help and guidance. You bet. I'm so happy to know that you're finding some benefit, right? And inspiration and, some maybe renewed fun in the kitchen as well from your experience here in the Ruby course. As for weight loss, there's certainly different ways to approach weight loss, and I'll share with you my personal experience as well as my, just my personal approach and opinions, I guess, about weight loss on a plant-based diet. And, first of all, I would say that a plant-based whole food, I really want to emphasize whole food where possible, right? Plant-based diet is in a lot of ways conducive to weight loss. And, when I think about weight loss, again, going off of my own experience as well as what's considered best practice, I think in the mainstream, that is to take it relatively slowly. As you make changes to your diet, as well as other aspects of lifestyle, right? I think exercise should be a good part of that. Some sort of movement, right? It doesn't have to be jogging per se, but it could just be other, forms of movement, like parking farther away from the grocery store entrance and walking across the parking lot, which is what I do, for example. But back to the food itself, right? So I want to emphasize the whole food aspect of a plant-based diet because it's in the whole food that you get fiber. And fiber, right, is sometimes an unsung hero that's so important to our daily diet. Certainly from a health standpoint. Fiber is nature's broom and keeps us cleaned out. And it does so many other things in terms of regulating metabolism and blood sugars and other things that we don't even know about, quite frankly. But consuming adequate fiber in its natural form is really the best way to do that. Natural form meaning in its whole food context versus taking a fiber supplement. All right, typically there's greater benefit in consuming it in its natural package, right? The whole food. So as we do that, we feel satiated, right? After the meal, versus a processed plant-based meal or one that has more refined foods or processed foods. And let's talk about this word processed a little bit here. Really, if you want to speak strictly about what whole food is, first of all, it's going to be what comes straight off the plant, right? So a beet or an apple, right? That's going to be the food in its true whole form. And once we start to cut it and to dice it and to peel it and to mince it and change its form in some fashion, we're processing it at that point. However, if we can eat all of the components, right, the skin and just as much of it as we can, then we're keeping intact with it, as far as our diet goes, the fiber, right, as well as the array of nutrients, the not just the macronutrients, but the all-important micronutrients that are present in all the different components of the food. And so it's really when we get into this aspect of refined foods like white flour, right, versus whole wheat flour or any other grain for that matter, right? It's when we start to remove components that were originally present, right, like the bran. That's when the food item becomes, first of all, less nutritious from a as far as all those micronutrients are concerned, but also less satiating as we remove bran. Bran, it tends to swell in our gut. It kind of slows down the movement of food. It sends certain messages to the brain. Again, in terms of our satisfaction or our satiety as we move through a meal. And so if we can do our best to avoid, certainly minimize, but in the best case scenario, to really avoid, heavily refined foods and to focus on more whole versions of that food, we're going to be better off in our attempt to lose weight. Lose weight meaning lose excess body fat, right? I mean, to lose weight can also come in other ways, right? In terms of losing muscle, which we usually don't want to do. But the other aspect of weight loss on a plant-based diet is to have some awareness, of course, of what foods we're eating in terms of their calorie density. Okay, so if we think about foods that are high in fats, right, a lot of our favorites, right, like avocados and seeds and nuts, right, nut butters, peanut butter, tahini, almond butter, these sorts of foods are calorie dense because of the fat content. And not that we typically want to eliminate or drastically reduce fat in the diet. That's often not a sound recommendation. Rather, balance is what we're striving for because fat has so many benefits in the diet. But I think it's important to be aware of which foods fundamentally are higher in fat, right? Relatively higher in fat versus other foods, and to moderate the consumption of those. For example, there certainly have been times in my past and maybe even my future where nut butters, due to their convenience, coupled with their beautiful mouthfeel and those wonderful flavors that come through, I found myself eating a lot of it. It's easy to dip a carrot stick into a celery stick, and it's a nice snack, smeared on some toast, and all of a sudden it's a substantial part of my breakfast. But I have gotten into patterns where I've eaten arguably too much of that, and over a period of time, I find that I've got some extra fat around my midsection, and my pants are a little bit tight. And so it takes kind of a stepping back and reassessing my macro diet at that point. What am I eating? Not just today, but what have I been eating over the course of the last couple of weeks or a couple of months even before this has come up. Now, also, I think it's interesting to keep in mind that, I think the calculation is 3,500 calories equals 1 pound So a pound of fat, right? So if we're consuming as little as an extra about 50 grams of energy each day across a year, you're going to put on an additional 7 pounds or more. And now 50 grams is not a whole lot of food. And so, if you're just sneaking in, an additional couple of teaspoons of peanut butter each day, you might be nudging up against that extra 50 grams or so of energy that you're consuming each day. But you don't notice it because it's such a small little item in your day. But all of a sudden across a year, you've put on 7 pounds or so. And so it's that sort of thing that is important for us to be aware of in our overall eating pattern. Okay, but otherwise, if very generally, if we shift toward a whole food, plant-based diet, we're going to be on the best path, I think, toward stabilizing weight. And then over the course of time to lose weight, specifically losing body fat, coupled with other lifestyle enhancements, specifically exercise or just general body movement, whatever form that comes in. Now, a couple of other things that have been successful for me as I have tinkered with weight loss. One is to eliminate snacking. Certainly to modify the types of snacks that I've eaten, but also to minimize and to eliminate snacks. Snacks are huge, right, in terms of adding calories or adding energy that we consume each day. So keep that in mind in terms of your bigger picture, your bigger strategy. If possible, eliminate snacks. Number two is to monitor portion size. I love to eat. And I love the sensual aspects of eating, and therefore I like to eat a lot of food. And it's very easy for me to put on excess weight. And so to be cognizant of portion size is important, and it's a very effective way to reduce body fat. So trim down portion size. Push away from the table. Remember that the pie feeds 12, right? All these little things can, I think, be tactics that you use. And then another thing that is also very helpful is to eat more slowly. Okay, I find that when I eat more slowly, I consume less food, and I've done deliberate experiments with this over 30-day periods of time, and simply considerably slowing down the pace of my eating does lead to less food consumption because I'm feeling satisfied. That satiety registers in my brain after 20 or so minutes, I think is what the research says. And so I end up losing quite a bit of weight over the course of 30 or 60 days, for example. And so I think if we couple all of those strategies with your plant-based diet, you're going to be on that solid path toward reducing body fat. Okay, so there's no magic otherwise. Okay, but to keep those in mind, try to incorporate all of those little by little, and stay away from food when it's not mealtime. All right, thank you. Okay, next up, which of these is healthiest, seitan, tofu, or tempeh? Wow, so this is in a way kind of a loaded question for me. It's a challenging question. It depends on maybe what it is, how we define healthy. And it's a difficult question because of that. We value different things generally in our food. We value things specifically depending on what our strategy is, our tactic is at that moment. So let me say that in terms of seitan, tofu, or tempeh, they can all be certainly part of a healthy diet, but as standalone foods, they all have merit. Seitan is the gluten, right? A couple of the proteins that we find in wheat that's pretty much isolated as we make seitan. Glutenin and gliadin are the two proteins that form to make gluten, and we extract that from wheat or wheat dough, and produce seitan. So seitan offers a lot of protein in a concentrated package, and I think the numbers run somewhere in the neighborhood of 75% protein for whatever unit that you're consuming, and that's pretty concentrated, much more so than any other natural food that or food in its natural form that I can think of, whether it's a soybean or a pork chop, for example. Now, tofu, right, is made from soybeans, as is tempeh. Tempeh tends to rely upon soybeans in their whole form. It's inoculated with a microorganism. It's fermented, so it's a different product than tofu, and therefore the nutrient profile is different. But again, each can offer a nice package of micronutrients along with the fat, carbs, and protein that you're going to find, even more so with seitan with tofu and tempeh, even more so than seitan, more fat and more carbs. Now, as we think about these standalone foods, and these are three great examples, many times, especially in North America, we concern ourselves with protein consumption, and that's often why a person is interested in seitan, tofu, or tempeh. Certainly, protein consumption is important. However, there's a body of evidence out there that suggests that, certainly in the United States, that on average we consume too much protein, and that in other words, there's an imbalance in the diet of many people, and an imbalance is not a good thing. We really should strive toward a varied diet. More plants is arguably more better, right, as it goes. So if we think about seitan, tofu, and tempeh, consume all three of them from time to time as part of the interesting components on your plate. And I don't think it's important to focus on the nutritional profile of these foods. I think from an academic, maybe sometimes trivial standpoint, it's interesting to know those things. But from a health and nutrition standpoint, it's really not important that we do, provided we're eating a variety of foods with balance, and then the nutrition follows. Okay, those are my thoughts on seitan, tofu, and tempeh in my own diet. Thank you. And a follow-up question, are any of these whole foods? Well, I guess I'll continue a little bit on what I started talking about with the earlier question from Jacqueline on losing weight and food selection. Tempeh is going to be the most whole, right, of the three examples here, represented by whole soybeans, and depending on the variety of tempeh, other whole legumes and greens. Those are all possible things that you could find in tempeh. Tofu is going to be the next item. It's going to be more processed than tempeh. And then seitan is going to be even more processed and even refined, right, as we try to isolate the gluten in the original wheat. So that's the gradation here. All right. Thank you. Next question, also from Gerald. What's the healthiest sweetener? Maple syrup, dates, honey, or something else? So there are, I don't know. It depends again on what you're looking for, what's going to be important to you. But any of these more whole sources of sweeteners or sweetness, right? Maple syrup, dates, honey, or some variety of those, right? So we have maple butter, we have maple sugar, right, which is the same thing as maple syrup, but just with varying water content, moisture content, based upon its reduction during processing. Dates, date sugar, date paste. These are potentially all the same thing, just varying in the way it's been processed. It still it has its wholeness to it, however. So which is healthiest? Again, they all offer a great array of micronutrients, along with sugar, some different types of sugar, whether it's glucose or sucrose. But again, what is ultimately the healthiest is really going to be a subjective call, and probably more based upon your taste preference or the way you might use the product in cooking, more than anything else, in my opinion, as a chef, and also a daily consumer of these things. So again, I would say enjoy them all. Enjoy them in, I would say, moderation, in balance with all the other goodness in your diet. All right, thank you. Next up, for this class, and vegan cooking, I take vegan cooking as whole food, plant-based cooking. What knives do I need beyond an 8-inch chef's knife, if any? A chef's knife is really all you need, in my opinion. If I have a chef's knife and I travel around the world, I can plug in anywhere and I think get all my work done. And so that has to do with skill development, right? And knowledge on using the knife, which I hope you'll continue to work on. But certainly at home here, I've got some other knives. Are they requirements? I don't know. They're certainly convenient, though. Paring knife, a serrated knife, and I've got I have Japanese style knives. I have European style knives. None of those are required. I mean, the whole set's not required, okay? But certainly start out with a chef's knife. And even, you mentioned 8-inch. An 8-inch isn't a requirement. It could be a 6-inch or 7-inch if you have particularly small hands, for example, and maybe are going to be processing smaller items or smaller quantities of food. 10-inch chef's knives are very common. Every once in a while, you might bump up against a 12-inch chef's knife, which gets to be on the big side. There are even larger knives than that. And that's going to depend upon how much food you're going to be processing at one time, in my opinion. In other words, knife length, right, is going to have a certain coverage across your cutting board. And so the more items the more quantity you're cutting at a given time, the quicker the job is going to be with a larger knife. And so that's going to be a consideration, balanced with your ease of using that knife. But an 8-inch chef's knife is going to be a good place to start. Again, you might consider a paring knife and a serrated knife to do the work of certain cutting jobs. Okay. But give it a try and then, see how you might want to branch out from there. All right. Thank you. Next up from Greg. What does Rouxbe mean by success rate in looking at the videos of the various recipes? Some are 100%, some 99%, some are much lower, like 60%. Is this an aggregate score from the faculty judging the students' work on that recipe? So these percentages that you see, aligned with the success rate heading, come from student feedback. and it's the student success rate for that particular recipe. And yeah, I certainly see some that are at 60%. And I would say take all of these numbers, whether they're at 100% or 60%, with your own grain of salt. Okay, and let me qualify this by saying that the recipes, right, that we have in our library, at most, all of them come from our in-house recipe tester, Dawn, who does most of it. And when Dawn makes the food, it's really good. I've had the goodness of eating a lot of Dawn's cooking, and I always welcome it. Now, so that is to say that when the next person makes it, whether it's me or whether it's you, the results will probably differ a little bit. And I think depending on how much knowledge and skill you bring into creating a recipe, right, your results will be arguably better or progressing, let's say, along the learning curve. And so, when you see a recipe that says 100% success, keep in mind that you might nail it on your first time out. But on the other hand, you might not. And it might take you a couple of tries before you feel like it's a really solid recipe. And in fact, your success that second or third time might have been based upon the way that you changed the recipe slightly, based upon your cooking equipment at home or other variables that enter into that cooking picture. Okay. Now, the same thing is true with a 60% score. Okay. When Don made the dish, it tasted fantastic. But for some reason, when a number of students made it, they rated it at 60%, let's say. And again, that has to do with your familiarity with the recipe. It has to do with your skill level. It has to do with the equipment that you're using, okay? As well as your personal preferences, right? In terms of saltiness or sweetness or texture development. And a lot of the way that we judge a recipe is subjective. And so that's why I say, take these ratings with your own grain of salt as you consider them. And certainly don't shy away from a recipe that's rated at 60%. It might end up being your favorite preparation after a couple of tries and you become familiar with it. All right, thank you. And next question. I'm having such a hard time making my meals for the week. It takes me so long just to make one meal. Please guide me how to manage this better. Aha, Doris. Practice makes better. One of my favorite lines. And so I suggest that you practice more via cooking more. And, I don't need to be a smarty pants by giving such a brief answer. But indeed, if we think about cooking and skill development and proficiency and ease around this activity, we can easily compare it to any other endeavor we're taking on. And let's say, for example, it's playing a musical instrument, right? It's, I would say, probably unreasonable for one to expect that we start classes with a music teacher. And, after 3 or 4 weeks, we're really good at playing the flute. It's going to take some time to learn all those notes, right? All those flavor notes, all those nuances of cooking. To develop our proficiency, our confidence, our control over the process so that we can do it quicker, with confidence, and with the results that we are anticipating, okay? And so it's with that sort of a bigger picture approach in mind that I say that practice really is the key to easier cooking. not to mention better cooking, more enjoyable cooking. When I say enjoyable cooking, I mean the process as well as the results. So start with the basics, just as our courses start with the basics. Knife skills, okay? And practice your safety along with the knife cuts, larger cuts, smaller cuts, square cuts, long and skinny cuts, until you can do all of those things, all the while making meals, right, more quickly and comfortably. And then you focus on cooking methods, right? Dry heat methods and moist heat methods, how to saute and develop color, how to sweat and not develop color, perhaps how to grill, how to bake, how to roast, how to simmer, how to steam. We're also shooting for degrees of doneness. Do we want something that's that just has the colors kind of locked in or set, but with a very firm texture to it? That's going to be blanching. And there's some practice around that to understand how much time we apply to what types of fruits or vegetables in order to get the results that we want. So there's a lot of nuance that goes into even something seemingly as simple as blanching. Okay. Caramelization. We can put some very light caramelization or browning on a food to develop something that looks a little more attractive and has a little bit of flavor, or we can develop more browning to develop arguably more visual interest and certainly more flavor development from that product. But then we get to a certain point where we start to pull out bitter notes as those sugars start to take a different profile, a different path. And so at what point on that spectrum of browning do we want to stop, right, for our own palate satisfaction? To balance that intensity of flavor, that umami that comes out of that satisfaction on the palate. A lot of times it's sweetness that comes out from many items, onions and carrots, for example, versus maybe a hint of bitterness to balance some of the sweet taste, or more bitterness or zero bitterness, right? So that's all just nuances just around browning. And certainly that's not going to come in a couple of weeks or even a couple of months. You'll need to keep on practicing. And then once you figure out how to do it to a carrot, it's going to be different on an onion. And you get to start that process, not from zero, but you get to start over in a certain way to get to know how onions act and react in the pan and to the heat and to the time that you're applying to them. Okay. So do have patience with your development around this skill set, this knowledge set. And your joy of cooking will develop. All right, thank you. From Rose, hello. I made the amazing tomato sauce, and well, I guess that could be a recipe name, or it could be your tomato sauce, right? And it was great, except the skins on my tomatoes didn't disintegrate into the sauce. They rolled up into little spikes. Yes, I've been there. Is this because the type of the tomato had a tough skin? Yes, it is. Recipe was for just chopped tomatoes. Yes. So there are many varieties of tomatoes out there, and each tomato has a different personality. And very often when we go to the grocery store, we're finding just 2 or 3, maybe 4 varieties of tomatoes, all of which, for the most part, there are exceptions during tomato season, but for the most part, we're finding tomatoes that have been, bred to be convenient for shipping and to have a relatively long shelf life at the grocery store, not for our convenience as cooks and consumers, but for the convenience of shippers and grocery stores, all right, that want to preserve their investment in that particular item in their inventory. And so the best way to create an item like a tomato that is going to resist the bumpy road in the back of a truck toward the grocery store and to be able to sit on the shelf for a few days is to create a tomato with a thick skin. And so this is very often what we see. And so if you are using tomatoes with a relatively thick skin, then consider blanching the tomato beforehand to remove the skin. And we have lessons on blanching to remove tomato skins. But very basically, you want to bring a pot of water to a rolling boil, and you'll drop in a couple, maybe 3 tomatoes at a time. In order to maintain a high temperature. You don't want to overload the pot, otherwise the temperature drops. Okay, so 2 or 3 tomatoes at a time. And you want to have an ice bath for shocking as part of your mise en place. And you want to blanch that tomato long enough for the skins to loosen up. And one way that we will prep the tomato to help us recognize that, as well as to help us peel the tomato, is to cut an X into the blossom end of the tomato before we drop it into the pot. Okay, and as the skin starts to loosen up, you'll see along the X cut line, the skin will start to lift up a little bit, and you can visually see that sometimes, but also if you will lift the tomato out. With a spoon, you can start to feel the tomato and start to feel the skin loosening up a bit. All right. Now, how long does it take to blanch a tomato? It depends on the tomato. If a tomato is less ripe and harder, it will require a longer blanching time. It might be 30 seconds. It could even be more than that sometimes in my experience. On the other hand, if a tomato is pretty ripe, it might only take about 10 seconds of blanching time. And so the difference between 10 and 30 or 40 seconds is a lot when you're talking about that boiling temperature. So you want to practice this and watch for the visual cues, touch the fruit, so you can start to learn about the different characteristics of the tomato. Once it's at a point where it's sufficiently blanched, drop it into the ice bath. And then the question is, well, how long do you shock it? Well, it depends, okay? You want to shock it until you've pulled out all the heat from the center of the tomato. That would be ideal, okay? Then the tomato is going to be easiest to handle, all right? Otherwise, it remains quite soft and has a tendency to get mushy as you handle it, including cutting it. So I recommend cooling it completely in lots of ice water in that ice bath, okay? And that could be 5 minutes or so, right? Probably not just 60 minutes, but probably more like 3, 4, 5 minutes, especially if you have more than one tomato in the ice bath, okay? But do peel the tomatoes, give that a try, and see how that amazing tomato sauce is for you. All right, thank you. Next up from Terry. As a chef, what type or brand of cookware do you prefer? I find that the copper-coated non-stick stuff that I was given really sticks pretty bad anyway. Do you prefer traditional or non-stick? Aha. So I happen to have examples of our cookware here at home. Okay, just what you wanted to see, right? What your chef instructor is using at home. Let me, first of all, answer your question by saying that I do not have any strong allegiance to a brand or a type of cookware. In fact, we have lots of different types of cookware and brands that we use in any given week. And let me run through some examples here, okay? Certainly stainless steel, okay? And, we've got a couple of sets of cookware, and we have a bunch of other individual pieces, usually multiples in a given category that we call our own. So we have stainless steel that we use daily. We've got hammered aluminum pots, and these are from India. And you can buy these here at very often at Indian grocery stores, and they come in different sizes, different shapes, right, for your convenience. We have some copper pans, and this one happens to be tin lined. In fact, it's going to need a re-tinning here at any time. But copper conducts heat really well. And so it's kind of a fun material to use. You got to keep that in mind, though, so you don't overheat the pans, especially if it's going to be tin lined, because you can actually melt the tin by overheating the copper pans. We've got enameled iron, cast iron, as well as black, unenameled cast iron, different shapes, different sizes. For different activities. Let's see, on this side, this is a clay pot, also from India, from Kerala in South India. This is a common home-style cooking pot that you would find, and we'll use this at home when cooking Indian dishes, especially South Indian curries. It gives us a nice feel, right? This idea of authenticity, right, which is subjective and open to a lot of interpretation anyway. But certainly there's a feel, right, an emotion that comes along with this idea of authenticity and how you recreate that, whether it's through ingredients or through the cookware you use or the way you set the table or the clothes that you wear. But arguably the food tastes different as well. Okay, based upon probably some real factors in the way heat is transferred through that cooking material, as well as the emotion that goes into eating the food at that time. We also have some of these carbon steel pans, or sometimes called French steel pans. These are kind of spot welded handles. Pretty, robust, heavy duty. This is all restaurant quality stuff. These things heat up really fast, and that's one of the advantages of using these in a restaurant, where time is of the essence when you're pushing orders through on the line. And so we'll use these for stir fries and for different sautéed dishes. I've got stone cookware. This is a Korean pot, often used to make rice as well as jigaes, soup dishes, but made of stone. And then last up, nonstick. We got a couple of these smaller nonstick pieces that we'll use. And so you can see right here that, I'm telling you that within a given week, probably most any given week, we're using all of these different types of cookware. So in that sense, I don't have an allegiance to any particular material or any particular brand. But what you will notice is that all of these, except for this last one, fall into the conventional, sort of traditional cookware category, in that they are not nonstick. Okay. What I recommend is, depending on your personality, if you have to have a matching set of cookware, that's fine. Go out and buy, find a cookware set that will be satisfying to your aesthetic, as well as fall within your budget. If money is no object, then you can tinker around with all kinds of things at the high end. Whether it's sets from Italy or France, or All Clad has some interesting multi-layered bonded types of cookware. Now, I find some of the more interesting solutions to be at the lower end of the price range, which is where I'm looking for good values. And Hinkle's has a stainless steel set. It must be, I don't know if it's 9 or 10 or 11 pieces, something like that. That's got a multi-layered cooking heat transfer surface on the bottom of the pan. It's got some a nice robust sort of connections here between handle and the cooking vessel itself, which is a place that I look. I'm always I'm trying to bend the pan to see if how rigid and how durable the handle is. And if I can bend it, I mean, I'm not like, doing the Incredible Hulk thing, but I'm putting in some pretty good pressure here to see how rigid it is. And there's some cookware that's really pretty flexy, and I just walk away from that immediately. I want something that's going to be pretty strong, okay? And that's what I recommend for you. It could be spot welded. It could be riveted. I find good cookware in either of those attachment designs for handle to the pan. In terms of non-stick cookware, I do not recommend that you purchase a full set of that, because over time, non-stick cookware will get scratches on it. It just happens. And which means that over time, your non-stick cookware will stick. And so for me, non-stick cookware is disposable cookware. All right. And you can see that even this one has got some scratches on it. And it's just about time for this to be replaced. And so I will have just 1 or 2 pieces of non-stick cookware. And then the rest of it is going to be your conventional sort of product, but as you can see, all different kinds of materials. Okay. Now, I don't, because a non-stick pan is disposable in my world, I don't spend a great deal of money on it. So I don't recommend all clad or something that's, going to be $100 for a 7-inch saute pan. Instead, I go down to my nearby restaurant supply store, and I'm going to grab something that's a lot less than that. A brand that I often use is Volrath, and I see the name right here on the handle. Volrath makes a lot of commercial cookware. It's not a brand that we see at Sur La Table, for example, but it's certainly one that I recommend, among other commercial, restaurant, brands that are out there. Okay, so hopefully that'll give you a couple of things to keep in mind as you consider cookware. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Suzanne. What is a good substitute for olive oil in salad dressing? So this is a fun question. Usually when we're using olive oil for a salad dressing, it's for the flavor. Okay, so if we are going to replace the olive oil, we want to think about other oils that have some flavor. This is one approach anyway. And other flavorful oils include sesame oil. There's hazelnut oil and walnut oil and pistachio oil and others. Not that we're probably going to use hazelnut oil, walnut oil, or pistachio oil in a 1-to-1 replacement in quantity for the olive oil, because of the flavor intensity as well as the expense of these examples that I just shared with you. Now, sesame oil can certainly be used as a 1-to-1 replacement if you like that flavor. That's the thing to keep in mind, is as we shift to other oils, there are going to be different flavors. You have to decide whether you like that flavor or how you might want to temper that. And the way to temper that, right, is this other path, and that is to use a refined oil. And a refined oil could be really anything out there, whether it's safflower oil or something else that you find at your grocery store. And you can always add one of these more robust flavored oils to that in the context of your salad dressing to make something that you like. Okay. But it becomes a personal decision at that point. Okay. Very subjective. Also keep in mind that if you are going to use some of these specialty oils, that they have a relatively short shelf life. So you'll definitely want to store them in the refrigerator. And then, even then, try to use them up just as quickly as you reasonably can, so they don't sit around for months at a time, because they will go rancid relatively quicker than many of our other mainstream oils. And it becomes, a an investment, so to speak, right, in that ingredient that you get to throw away at that point. Okay, but the quick answer then would be that you can use any oil as the substitute. You just need to figure out what flavor balance that you like for your salad dressing. All right, thank you. All right, next question. I also have a question about gluten-free vegan bread baking. The recipes I have rely upon whole eggs or egg whites to give the bread some lift and airiness. They also contain fats. I'm new to vegan diets, so I don't know how to make substitutions. Okay, so on the topic of gluten-free vegan yeast breads, okay, we're compounding the challenge here, okay, as we first of all take away the source of gluten, right, the wheat flour, okay, and we also take, if it's going to be vegan, we're taking away eggs, which would often go into an otherwise gluten-free loaf of bread that is yeast risen, okay? And these two ingredients, all right, gluten and eggs, provide structure to your bread. And so if we take away those two primary structure giving components or ingredients, then we're left to really redesign the loaf of bread. Okay, so that's why it becomes a challenge. Now, if we're working with quick breads, then it's much easier, much easier, because we can just very simply, increase the amount of chemical leaveners, right? The baking powder, for example, and we can find a balance that's going to be satisfying, to our aesthetic for that end product. But let's talk a little bit about yeast breads. Okay, now what you're going to find is, excuse me, on the market, you can find gluten-free bread flour blends, and I recommend that you start with using one of those products. So, for example, Bob's Red Mill has a gluten-free bread flour mix, right, a blend, and because there's so many variables otherwise that you need to understand, this is really an advanced baking question. So in order to simplify it a little bit, I suggest that you start with a commercially available gluten-free bread mix or blend that's going to have a gum in it, right? So a guar gum or xanthan gum or both of those to start to provide the structure, right, that's otherwise missing from that gluten-free product. Okay, and then as you move through a bread baking recipe, then I recommend that you find something online that you can work with. Very often, these gluten-free and vegan recipes that now are absent the egg component will have sometimes some additional gum added to the recipe. Okay, and that additional gum is not a lot. It could be a half a teaspoon approximately, right, of a gum to add some more structure that is now absent from omitting the eggs. Okay, now what you will also find in order to give some more leavening is the addition of a chemical leavener, even though you have yeast in this dough already. Okay, now we can use the yeast as a contributor, right, of leavening, but also as a contributor of flavor, right, to the end product. and then we use the chemical leavener as a boost of leavening. All right. Now, another difference that you are going to find is that typically you'll want to bake your bread longer. All right. So very often when we bake a loaf of bread, we can temp it. We can use a thermometer to check the temperature and the doneness. And, we can pull a typical loaf of bread at about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. But for a gluten-free and vegan loaf of bread, you'll want to push that to about 210 degrees Fahrenheit in order to dry it out a little bit more to help set the structure a little bit more before you pull it out of the oven. Okay. And then in order to, once it's out of the oven, in order to help it, that loaf dissipate moisture via the steam while it's still hot, you'll want to remove it from the bread baking pan fairly quickly. Now, just probably within a couple of minutes or so of removing it from the oven. So that the moisture can dissipate from all sides, and that's going to help that structure set up a little bit quicker as it cools. Okay, so a couple of additional tips to keep in mind. But again, just to summarize here, start with a commercially available gluten-free bread mix. Bob's Red Mill is going to be a great place to start. And then you might supplement with a gum. You might add not more than half a teaspoon. Sometimes it's a quarter teaspoon per loaf. An additional chemical leavener, often about a tablespoon. Okay. And then extend the cooking time, the baking time, in order to set the structure, and then try to cool it down pretty quickly in order to dissipate moisture, dissipate heat, again, to set the structure. All right. But it's going to take some experimentation, some practice on your part. So do have some patience with the process. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up from Hannah. Most whole food plant-based protocols are no oil. I suspect that Suzanne H. was looking for oil replacements entirely. Could you speak to that? I would have suggested diluting with water or stock, or replacing with a smaller amount of tahini, almond butter, hemp, etc. Okay. Okay, so referencing the olive oil and salad dressing question. Okay. So yeah, we can collectively talk about this a little bit here. In our Ruby courses, as well as in our recipe lineup, we have a lesson section on no oil dressings that are avocado based. So you have some nice fat. They're also, they might be cashew cream based. You're getting some nice mouthfeel from the fat that's present, or they might be based upon balsamic vinegar with the addition of a fruit paste. So you've got the fiber that provides some body that's going to cling to the salad components. It's going to provide some satisfaction on the palate, as well as the other ingredients that are going to give some interest, such as sourness through the vinegar or the addition of a citrus juice, in particular lime juice or lemon juice. And then, again, some of that satisfaction on the palate, as well as the clinginess to your salad components through the fat or through fiber. Okay. So do take a look at those suggestions, and then you can start to branch out from there and modify flavors, right? Herbs and spices and different dried fruits to make the fruit puree, different vinegars to bring in different flavors, for example. Now, another approach to a salad dressing that totally omits added oil is to use stock. Or even a fruit juice, such as apple juice, if you want a sweet profile, or some sweetness that you can balance with other savory components. But you can thicken the stock or the juice with a slurry, so a cornstarch slurry, for example. So what you need to do is heat the stock of the juice in a saucepan, and then you'll thicken it with a slurry, and then you'll cool it down, and then that's the component that replaces oil in that salad dressing recipe. And then you can follow. So what you want to do is, in terms of how much slurry you add, you want to mimic the consistency of the oil that you're replacing. Okay. And then you can add all of the same flavorings that you might have used in that original oil-based dressing. And the results can be very, very satisfying. Again, you want to have some body so that on your palate you have a sense of satisfaction, and the dressing will cling to the components of the salad. All right. So give that a try. Thank you. All right. Okay. And I guess just as a quick follow-up, Hannah suggests, using tahini, almond butter, hemp butter. Yes. Great suggestions, all of them, depending on the style of the dressing that you want to make. All right. Thank you. Okay. So next question. After this class, I heard there is another plant-based class. Is it longer, more in-depth, costs more? How is that different from this one? So, Gerald, I'm guessing that you're originally referencing the Forks Over Knives course. We have two versions of those, a short version and a longer version. The ultimate is the longer version. And then on top of that, we have our professional plant-based certification course. I sometimes call it the Pro Plant course. And the Pro Plant course is in the neighborhood of 3 times the length of the Forks Over Knives course. Covers a lot of content, a lot of different directions in the plant-based world. And it is one that's draws the attention of, I'll say, serious home cooks, or those that have some sort of aspirations to dabble in food in a professional sort of manner, whether it's in food writing or food photography or cooking in all its different guises. And so that one is really a beautiful course. It is more expensive, and you can visit our website at rouxbe.com and drill down to our course offerings to see what the list price is. Keep in mind that we often run a little discount seasonally for different occasions, and you might keep an eye out for some of that. Okay, thank you. Let's see. Next up, Sunny, regarding the garlic confit recipe on Rouxbe. I've read all comments, including the document you uploaded regarding garlic and food safety from UC Davis. I understand storing garlic in oil can be dangerous. So how is this recipe different, safer? Thank you. So, the concerns, the food safety concerns associated with garlic and garlic in oil sort of preparations is botulism. Okay. And, botulism is usually associated, it comes with the food item, comes from the soil very often. There are certainly other sources of it in terms of cross-contamination. Now, if we're, handling our food properly, right, in terms of cleaning it, in terms of cooking it properly, to kill microorganisms, then our risks, right, our concerns should be significantly diminished. And we have a lot of control as a cook. Now, the other part of this is storage temperature. Okay, microorganisms, right? They're alive, and they like warm-ish temperatures. So at about our body temperature, right, is a very nice temperature for other microorganisms to be happy. And when microorganisms like people are happy, we tend to um, duplicate, right? So the numbers grow at room temperature, at these warmer temperatures. So, store your preparations in the refrigerator. That would be the second thing to keep in mind. And then the other part of this is time, right? Any sort of foodborne illness magnifies or multiplies as a result of temperature and time abuse. That's the terminology we use in the professional kitchen. Temperature and time abuse, which means we need to be cognizant of temperature for storage, as well as cooking, that overall handling of the food product, and then the time at which a product stays at a particular temperature, namely in the danger zone. And so the danger zone is this sort of middle range of warmer temperatures where the microorganism is most apt to multiply. So in other words, if we eat our food within a reasonably short period of time, then we can minimize or eliminate the concern. All right, so we've got handling of food, right? Cleaning, cooking, temperature awareness, bring foods up to 165 degrees Fahrenheit and more, typically, right, to cook them and to kill microorganisms, and then store them under refrigeration to slow down any multiplication of existing microorganisms, and then use those products timely. So those microorganisms don't have so much time to multiply and then spoil the food in one fashion or another. All right, thank you. Let's see, next up, do I need to worry about high smoke points? So what's a smoke point? Smoke point refers to the temperature at which an oil really starts to break down and starts to smoke. And so that's our cue, our visual cue that we've entered that temperature range where we usually don't want to be, okay, because the oil is being damaged, which means that the flavor is also being degraded. And by the way, the next stage that we enter, or the next point that we reach, is called the flashpoint. And that's when your oil bursts into flames because it's so hot. And you don't want to experience that. But in terms of smoke point, yes, we should be generally cognizant of smoke point. And I'll generally say that less refined oils have lower smoke points, right? So they'll start to smoke at a lower temperature. More refined oils have a higher smoke point. So you can push them to a much higher temperature and they're going to be stable. Flavors will not degrade so quickly that we notice them. You're not going to see smoke coming off of the pan, for example. So, better olive oils, walnut oil, pistachio, hazelnut oil, less refined sesame oil. All of these will have relatively lower smoke points. And so they're often used for food preparation where heat is not applied, such as a salad dressing, or where only light heat is applied. So very more delicate saute work or sweating in the pan at lower temperatures. But if you are going to do some more robust deep frying or higher temperature work in your wok, stir frying or sauteing, then you might reach for a more refined oil with a higher smoke point. Okay, so that's generally what you want to keep in mind. All right, thank you. And next question. So are there job placement or job referral services in North America or abroad once the certification course has been completed? At present, right now, at Rouxbe, we do not have job placement service. I'm glad you asked that question, though, Daryl. That is a point of conversation that has come up recently. And it's something that we may move toward in the future, but at present we do not offer that service. However, it depends on what avenue of cooking professionally that you want to get into. You might take a look at professional organizations that exist that are aligned with the particular area of cooking that you're interested, whether it's in the personal chef realm, for example, or pastries versus the savory kitchen. Each of these areas of the greater food industry, has organizations that you can join. There's usually a membership fee associated with that, that offer some sort of a job board or some sort of a networking service to help you find employment. Okay, so you might consider those professional organizations. Thank you. All right, next question from Susan. What liquid sweeteners are allowed on forks over knives? This ingredient is listed in several recipes. Is honey allowed? So let's talk about this. Okay, I'll start with honey as maybe the more controversial of our liquid sweetener options. Honey is allowed if you want to use it. I'll leave that up to you. Okay, and I will contextualize this by addressing two sort of headings here, and one is the word vegan versus whole food plant-based. Okay, and so historically, as we have used the word vegan, veganism, vegan diet, vegan lifestyle, there's been a political underpinning, okay, to this approach, because it's a lifestyle. At least it has been. Things have shifted a bit in more recent years, such that the term vegan is used a little more broadly, and I'll say a little more loosely, to refer simply to a plant-based diet. Okay, but still, for many people, the term vegan or vegan diet is narrow, and it means no honey. All right, in addition to all those other no plant or no animal-based foods. Excuse me. Okay, there are still a lot of folks out there, right, that adhere to a broader vegan lifestyle, which omits any leather, right, and any other animal-derived things in your environment. No leather seats in your car, for example. Okay. On the other hand, we have the term or the heading plant-based, right, or whole food plant-based, which really focuses on food and cooking and omits the politics of the food. Okay, so if you adhere to a whole food plant-based sort of an approach, then honey may fall into your diet. If you're taking a harder, stricter vegan approach, perhaps honey does not fit into your diet. Okay, so you get to figure out where your politics lie before we make the decision on honey. But otherwise, in Forks Over Knives, we offer an array of sweeteners, whether it's a liquid sweetener or not. And so it's really up to you to decide what you want to use, whether it's agave syrup or maple syrup or a date paste or something else. Okay, there are many, many options out there. I think the most important thing to keep in mind, generally speaking, from a health standpoint, as well as specifically from the FOK standpoint, and that is to moderate your intake of these sweeteners. Okay, more than the source of the sweetness or the sweetener, it's really the abundance of this in your diet that is problematic. Okay, so that's probably the most important thing to keep in mind. All right, thank you. Where does agave rank as a healthy sweetener? There's different ways to rate that, right? One of them is to take a look at agave on how quickly it enters your bloodstream, and how quickly your body metabolizes these various sweeteners, and otherwise it's flavor, right? Flavor quality is part of the assessment process. Depends on how you might use the sweetener. And if we look at baking, for example, the way that sweeteners act and react in the environment of baking can differ. And based upon acidity, based upon moisture content and texture, resulting texture, for example, not to mention flavor intensity. And so we might make some sort of an assessment from that angle as well. But I mean, ultimately, sweeteners, these sugars are sugars, and from as far as healthiness is concerned, we should be moderating all of them. That would be the prudent approach to any of these. But as far as a glycemic index rating goes, you might take a look specifically at agave syrup if that interests you. Okay, thank you. Next up, I'm not thinking liquid smoke is healthy from my internet checks. Is there a whole food plant-based substitute that is healthy? It's been in a fair number of FOK Ruby course. I mean, liquid smoke is a processed food. And, generally speaking, I would say that any of these processed and sort of refined foods in abundance are certainly not good for you. You might want to moderate your liquid smoke intake as well, as far as that approach goes, I would say. As a convenience product, you're right. It does appear in a number of recipes, whether it's in the FOK course or in the broader cooking world. And people have their preferences one way or another, right? I find that liquid smoke often leaves a little bit of an artificially sort of a flavor on my palate. I have a very sensitive palate, and so I pick up on those things. So my preference is to use a different approach. And, for example, a natural source of smoke is to, use a piece of charcoal or a piece of wood that you might use in your grill, and actually, burn it, right? Make some charcoal and until it starts to smoke. And then you can put that into a small container, metal container, and then put that into your larger vessel that you're cooking your food in, put a lid on it to trap that smoke. And it'll impart smokiness from a more natural source. Okay, and that's what we do at home. It's pretty easy to do, and I certainly would recommend that you give that a try. Okay, now there are other newer technologies that you can use. These small little smoking devices that it's really doing the same thing, except it's putting wood chips or wood dust into a nice little package in the way of this smoking, this little handheld smoker, for example, and you can pump smoke into a vessel to introduce that flavor. If you're otherwise smoking something, you can try some. Of course, there's your grill, right? That you can kind of set up as a smoker. But there's also a simple stovetop smoker that you can construct. And an easy way to do that is to get one of these disposable aluminum pans. It could be something as small as a pie pan. And you'll want to have a grate that'll fit inside that pan. So it'll need to be round if you're using a round, pie pan, or you can buy these rectangular shaped disposable hotel pans at a restaurant supply store, and then a rack will fit in there. You'll want to raise that up just a little bit. I use little balls of aluminum foil at each corner to create some space underneath the rack. Underneath there, I'm going to put some dampened wood chips. and that's going to be the source of my smoke. I also want a second aluminum pan that I'll use as a cover, and I'll put the setup over directly over fire, and to start to burn those chips, create the smoke, and then I can, I will have removed the rack. I'll set up my food on the rack, and then once the smoke starts to be generated, I'll lift up the lid and then slide in the rack of food, replace the lid, and then give that some time to smoke. And you have to experiment on how smoky you want the product before it gets bitter, for example. Okay, but that's another option for introducing smoke from a more natural source. All right, thank you. All right, next up. So when making a balsamic reduction, is it okay to use a cheap brand of balsamic vinegar off the shelf? Also, what's the best way to store onion and garlic powder to prevent lumps occurring? Okay, so a couple of good questions here. So balsamic vinegars, as we probably know, range tremendously in price and quality. So as we answer this question, we're not talking about the high-end stuff, right? The tradizionale products from Modena, for example. But we're talking about a much less expensive products that is not made in the traditional sense, that we can find readily at a grocery store. Even at many of the discount grocery stores, we'll find these products. Even within this category, quality ranges quite a bit. And in my experience, quality doesn't always align with price. In other words, you can find some fairly inexpensive product that is relatively nice in terms of its flavor on the palate and its ability to be reduced. Okay. So there will need to be some experimentation on your part if you want to play with some of the inexpensive products. Now, the good news is they're inexpensive. So you might only be spending, $7 or $8 on a bottle. And then you can maybe go out and, you might just buy one or two at a time and kind of practice with it. And if it doesn't reduce very nicely, then you can just continue to use it in other aspects of your cooking. And it could be quite enjoyable as you move on to that next bottle to experiment with as far as reduction is concerned. Now, I'll give an example of a brand that I have had success with, and this is from a small purveyor in California by the name of Stutz, Stutz, and the website is stutzco.com. And so under the Stutz brand, there's a balsamic vinegar. And it's a fantastic value, really. It's actually from Modena, but not made in the traditional sense. It's one of the shortcut method balsamic vinegars, but a relatively good quality one. Sweetness is good, flavor is good, acidity is nicely balanced, and it reduces nicely. Now, the catch here is if you go to the website, you got to buy it by the case, 12-bottle case. And it's certainly affordable, so you might consider, gifting some of these to your friends and family. But otherwise, you'll need to experiment with some of the less expensive brands of balsamic vinegar to find the ones that are going to suit your palate as you make a reduction slowly over low heat. All right. Part two of the question: how best to store onion and garlic powder to prevent lumps? Thank you, Patrick. So we had the stutzco.com website that just popped up for your reference. Back to the question on lumps. And of course, lumps are caused by humidity. And so we want to protect these granular food items from humidity. One way to do that is certainly to buy in smaller quantities so that we can work through the product faster and perhaps avoid the lumps. Now, if that's not an option, then on the other side, consider adding grains of salt. I'm sorry, not salt. grains of rice to the container of the granular garlic or onions, and the rice grains will absorb humidity in the air and will tend to keep these things like salt as well as granular onion and garlic a little more flowing. All right, thank you. And next question. The label on the tofu package lists calcium sulfate and magnesium chloride in the ingredients section. Are these stabilizers to make the tofu last longer? Are they found in all tofu? Should I check tofu labels to avoid some ingredients? So these items that you have mentioned are coagulants. And so they are part and parcel of the tofu making process as you move from soy milk to the set products. And so sometimes one or the other, sometimes a combination, but yeah, these two things nonetheless are going to be the setting agents, the coagulants that are used. So you're probably not going to be able to avoid them. Now, otherwise, you might take a look at an ingredient list and see that it doesn't have much else beyond that, right? You should have soybeans, and then the coagulant, and then see if there are any other stabilizers that you might want to avoid, okay? But otherwise, in terms of the shelf life of tofu, I'll make a quick comment here, it's pretty short, okay? And, I recommend that if once you open a package of tofu, that you keep it submerged in fresh water and change the water daily. If it stays in that beanie water, it will spoil much faster. Also, if it's not submerged in the water, if a part of it is sticking up out of the water, that part that's sticking up will also spoil much faster. You can always, if it does spoil, and you'll know it because it changes texture to a slimy texture and takes on a bitter flavor. You can cut that off and use what is still submerged. But you can avoid all that by changing the water each day and then keeping the leftover tofu submerged, and then use your tofu. Eat it up in a reasonably short amount of time. Thank you. Next from Brenda. Sometimes in a recipe, it calls for using a hand mixer. Is there a difference between using a hand mixer or using a stand mixer? Not necessarily. I don't think there necessarily is, aside from the convenience that you might experience, as you use the tool. It might be lighter, for example. But otherwise the results can be quite equivalent. All right. And next question, tempeh made by Tofurky, so Tofurky brand products, can be hickory smoked or smoky maple bacon. What do you think of these products? Does using these products differ from using traditional tempeh? I'm assuming they do not need to be simmered in a flavorful liquid, etc. So I'll start from the tail end of your sequence of questions here, Teresa, and say that these products, as I am familiar with them, come very moist as they're packaged. And so you're correct. They do not need simmering, as we often recommend for traditional tempeh that tends to be fairly dry and hard and relatively stiff. And what you've described here is a convenience product, and so they're flavored. They're often pre-sliced, and so they're ready to go to make a sandwich or to put on the plate after maybe being quickly browned and warmed up in a saute pan. I think if you want to eat tempeh once in a while as a convenience product, it can be quite nice. It has its place in the market. Take a look at the ingredient list. You're going to find many, many more ingredients than what you might find in a traditionally made tempeh, which has a pretty short ingredient list. And so, think about what you might want to be adding to your body, right, or not, in terms of ingredients that are not required, right? But there's a trade-off, right, when it comes to convenience. So you get to weigh that as well. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Amin. I'm trying to make a gluten-free vegan bread that rises. Will you please tell me what I should think about in terms of, one, the gluten-free flour mixture, and two, how to make the dough rise while baking? I can't seem to get the yeast to activate. Okay, so I answered this for the most part in the earlier question, right, on the gluten-free vegan bread question, but I'll add a couple of additional thoughts here. So, just to provide some clarification and maybe some reassurance around the quality of your yeast, you mentioned that you can't get the yeast to activate. And my guess is that you're probably activating the yeast just fine, but because there's inadequate structure in the dough, the gases produced by the yeast are escaping, and therefore the bread isn't rising. Okay. And so this is where we run into that structure problem again. And this is why I first recommend using a commercially available gluten-free flour mix, such as these products from Bob's Red Mill, for example. It will have the addition of gum, guar gum or xanthan gum, sometimes both will be present. And then there may or may not be a chemical leavener added to that. It's often a good idea to add a chemical leavener, a tablespoon or so of baking powder to give an additional punch of gas, right, to give you some rise for the final product. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you want to bake it a little bit longer than you would a conventional loaf of bread, to about 210 degrees Fahrenheit to dry it out some more to get that structure to set up. And then also, do remove it from the baking pan fairly quickly after removing it from the oven to let it cool down, and that cooling will further set the structure. Okay, so it doesn't collapse under its own weight. Although you will typically, it's not uncommon to see some settling of a bread in the gluten-free and vegan category. Okay, but give that a try. Thank you. All right, next up, I need help figuring out what to serve for a dinner for 2 or 4. Could you give some ideas of an entree with sides that might work? I could use some novel, not too difficult ideas. Okay, so Sharon, I'm going to answer your question very generally. Okay, because I'm sure that our palate preferences are a little different, and not to mention all the other variables in the kitchen are going to be a little bit different here. So, I'll first say that for those of you that are in the Forks Over Knives course, right, the Forks Over Knives Ultimate course, if you refer to Unit 8, that is going to be the unit where we have a lot of meal ideas or meal inspirations. So it's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I think there might even be some snack ideas in there. If you're in the Forks Over Knives Essentials course, it's going to be in Unit 4. If you're in the longer course, right, the Pro Plant course, then that's structured a little bit differently. We have really a smattering of recipes all through that course. However, you might take a look toward the end of the course for some more specific flavor and service ideas around units 16 and 15 and even a couple of them before that get into global flavors for some inspiration. Okay, but as you take a look at Unit 8, for example, in the FOK Ultimate course, just run through some of those examples, and there are vegetable burger ideas that are Indian inspired in terms of the flavor profile, or maybe more Mediterranean leaning in terms of a flavor profile. You can certainly alter some of those by swapping in and out different herbs and spices. There are a number of one-pot meals that are suggested as well. There's a choucroute garni, which is traditionally a root vegetable and kind of a cabbage focused recipe that would have a lot of meat in it, but in this case, it's going to be without the meat, so it'll be rich in these other again, root vegetables and cabbage ingredients. And here we have some acidity from vinegar. We've got some herbs, and you can certainly play with herbs and spices as you gain some experience with that preparation, for example. There are other preparations around legumes that are popular with our students. There's a coconut chickpea one-pot meal that uses sun-dried tomatoes or other forms of tomato with some greens and some nice souring agents, lemon juice, could be lime juice, for example. That can be very satisfying as well. In terms of side dishes, I think about salads. You think about legume salads or grain salads, or some sort of a green salad that might have the addition of some toasted nuts, maybe just the addition of a small handful of grains or legumes for a little additional texture to that otherwise vegetable-based salad. You might bind all of that with one of our no-oil dressings for a very satisfying meal. But again, you'll want to take a look at the selection of some of these suggested recipes to see what might best suit your palate preferences and those preferences of those at home. Okay, but start there for some ideas. Thank you. Let's see. Next up. Let's see. So these open office hours are really great. Thank you. Well, you're welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Is it okay to use sprouted onions? If yes, do we use both the green shoot and the inner root? They're certainly edible. I certainly find myself using sprouted onions from time to time. Very often with the sprouted onions and other members of the allium family, garlic, for example, they will start to break down on the inside. And so just be aware of that. So you can, remove layers that get a little bit brown or a little bit soft. It's otherwise edible. If you're ever in question, just slice off parts of the onion at different points and put it in your mouth and see how you like it. And I don't find anything offensive about the sprouted onions. And so do give it a try. Thank you. How can I be a good caterer? Wow, there have been books written to answer this question. Well, very quickly, I would say learn to cook well in many different areas, depending, again, of what your preferences might be, but different areas of cooking that might include baking to some limited extent to satisfy your customers, as well as pastry or other aspects of the sweet kitchen that are often part of a catering menu that you might offer. International cuisine, I think, should be part of one's cooking repertoire, generally speaking, and certainly if you're a caterer. And then, once you gain some experience in these different areas of cooking, some confidence and some skill development, knowledge of the array of ingredients that are on the market, consider working for somebody else for a while, somebody's catering company, to gain some experience on logistically how it's done. Catering can be as much of a logistical game as it is a cooking endeavor. And so, how do you accommodate at one time 50 guests or 500 guests. Cooking is often a secondary issue. It's how do I prepare and hold and serve food of maximum quality to so many people at once? How do I deliver this food in the case of off-site catering? If it's on-site catering, I need a facility that will accommodate 500 people, right? Or 50 people, whatever your maximum capacity might be. But to get that experience while working for somebody else is going to be a really sound idea, so that you can start to work out some of the challenges and some of the pitfalls that you might otherwise not see without that experience. All right, thanks. And next up, so to pack prepared meals for camping, could I food safe pack by vacuum sealing? Would this need refrigeration? Would this work for some foods better than others? Okay, great. Yeah. So I love to plan the menu for camping, and it's a regular thing, multiple times a year for us. And we try to really kick it up and have some fun with the food that we take. And so vacuum sealing can be helpful, certainly in terms of organizing your meal and organizing components of the meal that you can then bring together to create whatever it is that you have on your menu as the finished product. Would they need refrigeration? Typically, yes, right? As we use a vacuum, sort of technology for sealing and organizing, it's often cooked food or par-cooked food that we might be packaging. In which case, yes, definitely refrigerated. Otherwise, your shelf life is only limited to a few hours until usually the spoilage bacteria kicks up and you start getting some funky aromas, and then textures break down, and then you don't want to eat it, right? So think about refrigeration, how you might refresh your quantity of ice, midway at a grocery store nearby, for example. Does it work with some foods better than others? Wow, this is potentially a big discussion here, and I'll share just a couple of thoughts here, and then if you have more specific questions, Kathy, you can follow up with me at support@rouxbe.com, and then we can continue the conversation. But on one hand, I like to keep foods in original containers if possible. I'll give you, one example. In the past, if I've had scrambled eggs on the menu, taking shell eggs, in your big carton of 12 or 18 is fine, but that can get a little unwieldy at times as the carton gets wet and starts to disintegrate and eggs fall out and they crack. So an option is to buy whole eggs in a carton. And this is where you would want to go to your nearby restaurant supply store, where those sort of things are going to be a regular inventory item because they're used in restaurants so frequently. And so that becomes an easy way to keep eggs in its original container. It's upright in a skinny, like a 1-quart container. So it's easy to pack also in your cooler. It doesn't take up, sideways horizontal space like a carton of eggs in the shell would. But otherwise, in terms of vacuum sealing goes, certainly, I would have to think that some things might work better than others, but maybe not. You might try some experimenting first of all, based upon what kinds of foods you intend to take or want to experiment during your camping trips. You might just try them out ahead of time at home. Go ahead and vacuum pack some things, store them in the fridge for a couple of days or 3 or 4 days. Or better yet, not in your fridge, but in your cooler with ice, because conditions will vary in the cooler. And you really want to replicate those, camping conditions. And so you might just prepare some meals over the course of a couple of days out of your cooler at home and really experiment. And you can fine tune what's going to work best for you. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up, does humidity affect yeast bread dough? I live in Arizona and our humidity is usually less than 10%. Humidity certainly can. And, when we have something like dough or any other wet preparation, and if we especially get into, lower moisture in the air is pulling moisture out of the dough. And so there is some compensation that may be necessary. However, we can often, mitigate that by keeping dough covered. And, usually when we, once we mix our wet and dry ingredients, we make the dough, we go through that, maybe an initial fermentation, that rising stage. We'll want to cover it tightly with some plastic wrap, and that can really control any moisture loss at that stage. And then same thing with your subsequent 1 or 2 stages of rising. Try to keep things covered. But if you find that your end product is coming out a bit on the dry side, then you might want to introduce a little bit more moisture from the beginning. Now, keep in mind that you'll want to develop some skill around using a more slack dough, right? A softer dough that has more moisture in it. It takes a little bit of practice because it can get a little unwieldy. A very wet dough does, but that would definitely alleviate your concern around baking in a dry environment. Okay. Okay, so another question from Daryl regarding employment. Do you have any data that indicates Ruby students are being hired without practical experience? No, we don't have any specific approach to collecting that data at this point. We certainly have, some, evidence through informal feedback and very occasional feedback from students that tell us that they're doing some blogging, or they're doing one thing or another around food, and the way they're monetizing it, of course, is going to differ as well. For example, it's one thing to go out and be hired by a restaurant and immediately receive a paycheck 2 weeks later, versus starting a food blog and really reaping a monetary reward 2 years later, right after you've developed your following and you've found a way to monetize it effectively. And so I think even the data, right, can vary quite a bit in terms of its meaning. But I don't have the data that I think you're looking for, Daryl, okay, in terms of maybe immediate employment. Okay, thank you. Let's see, next up from Carol. I need a better technique for making coconut butter in the Vitamix blender. It seems to get stuck partway through. Some hardens before all has been incorporated. I have to keep loosening it with a knife to complete the blending. Okay. Well, I guess it kind of depends on just what the process is here. But if you're able to add some liquid to the mixture to keep it loose, that liquid water, right, should be hot water. The hotter, the better, in order to basically keep the overall mixture above about 5 degrees or so, 70, 75 degrees, where the coconut is going to be a little bit softer, more free-flowing. And that's going to be my quick response to your question here. Try to warm up your bowl in some fashion to help with that, the fats loosening up. Okay. And it could be warm towels that are heated with hot water, right? It's just as hot as you can handle it, coupled with maybe a little drizzle of some boiling water into the bowl as well. Thank you. Next up, when heating my pan for sauteing and I arrive at the mercury ball test, what's the best way to keep the heat consistent? It's just practice, right? And let me contextualize the mercury ball test. Okay, the mercury ball test, on one hand, is a good way to warm up let's say a stainless steel pan, or otherwise a non-stick pan, in a way to minimize sticking. Okay. But keep in mind that depending on what we're actually cooking in the pan, it might be necessary to lower the pan temperature from the mercury ball test stage. Okay, that's often too hot for cooking items that are high in sugar, that have a tendency to brown very quickly and therefore even burn relatively quickly. But otherwise, in terms of maintaining consistent heat, if you're using a more typical cooktop, an electric cooktop or a gas cooktop, then, actually, it really doesn't matter. There's going to be a lot of variation in the cooking. There is some newer technology that can more precisely maintain a narrower range, a more precise temperature. I'm not sure. I don't have brand names off the top of my head, but you can Google that sort of thing and find some of that latest technology. But otherwise, there's always a fluctuation in temperature. There's always adjustment. Now, once you add something to the pan, that cooler item is going to cool the pan. As soon as the food sits there, the heat from the bottom of the pan is going to raise the heat of the pan. So it's all a matter of control based upon your analysis of the food. So we're constantly watching the food, and we're smelling it, we're listening to it, we're sometimes touching the food. We might use a thermometer to temp the food, and then make the adjustment in temperature to get to where we want to be. Okay, so there's not a simple, quick answer to share with you here. Okay, practice, practice, practice. Next up, I'm a new vegan. How can I get protein in this kind of a plant-based meal? Okay, there's a body of research out there that says that all the plants that we consume contain protein-building amino acids. Okay, so we're really so here we need to, I'll slow down a bit and just talk for very briefly about complete proteins versus incomplete proteins, and what that's about. As we look at the animal sources of food, those are all going to have protein that contains all of the essential amino acids, and hence it's called a complete protein. And these essential amino acids are amino acids that our body does not produce, and so therefore we need to go to a food source to get them. So animal sources of food come in this complete package that's referred to as a complete protein. Now, plant foods have the amino acids, but in differing quantities, and so as we eat different plant foods, there's kind of a puzzle that's being built within our body. Naturally, it does that as we metabolize food. and our body is going to grab onto the amino acids that are required to build proteins. Okay, it's going to be the same amino acids, but they're going to come together in a different sort of a way than if they came from an animal source of food. And there's, again, plenty of evidence out there that tells us that the protein that we get from plants is entirely adequate for our needs. So the important thing here is to continue to eat a varied diet, right, of plant foods, maintain a balanced diet, right, in terms of macronutrients, and you're going to get all of those nutrients that you require. Now, the added benefit, right, of the plant-based diet is that typically we're going to get many, many more micronutrients that you would from eating a heavy animal-based diet. Okay, but in other words, there really is no concern about getting adequate protein. Now, I'll also add very briefly here that there's research out there that says that at least in the standard American diet, folks are eating too much protein, and that even the recommended guideline of protein is higher than it needs to be. And so, in other words, the concern for eating protein is really not a concern at all for most all of us. Okay, thank you. And next up, I got a fresh basil to start indoor herbs. Okay, it is hydroponic, but in a few days, some of these have dark spots and they're curling under. Is this normal? Suggestions for growing home herbs with which ones to grow. Thank you. Yeah, so let me just full disclosure here. I don't have a hydroponic setup at home here, and it's been many years since I've been around hydroponic cultivation of any sort. So I don't have all the nitty-gritty to answer your question. Now, if you want to send your question in to support@rouxbe.com, I'd be happy to direct it to probably Ken, who I know has got a super duper setup at home and could probably answer your question with some nice detail. All right, thank you. Next up from Carol, I have really enjoyed these live events. When is the last one for the Essentials course I'm in now? How will we be notified of other live events that we will have access to when this course is over? So the live events are ongoing. We've got different people on our team that will be doing that do live events, and so these are on an ongoing basis. And you can certainly check in on our schedule when you log into rouxbe.com. Scroll down to the bottom of the page, click on live events, and there, you'll see the upcoming live events as well as our archives of past live events, including live office, office hours, as well as theme-specific live events. And you can keep track of what's going on from that page. All right, thank you. Say that again. Okay, yeah, then you'll have a chance to also sign up for the events that are coming up in the coming week. All right, thanks. What's your favorite dressing for whole grain salads, such as farro and barley? And when do you recommend adding the dressing? When I use no oil dressing to grain salad, it tends to absorb all the liquid if I add it in advance and store it in the fridge. Lately, I must say that my favorite dressing has been a tahini olive oil dressing. And I will bring in some lemony aspects to it, whether it's lemon juice, certainly the lemon zest. If we've got preserved lemon in the house, I'll chop up some of that. That goes into the dressing. And then otherwise, seasoning adjustment beyond that might be done in the salad proper, or it could be done in the dressing, either way. But I like that. And I've been using that to bind grain salads. And I also like to introduce, I guess in the spirit of a tabbouleh, a lot of parsley to the salad as well. And there's a lot of fat, so it's very satisfying. It clings very nicely. You don't necessarily need a whole lot of it because the flavor is very rich. In fact, if you add a lot of this dressing, it can get a little cloying. It can be so thick. But if I add a little bit of a vegetable, something like the parsley, sometimes there's going to be a small dice of onion that might go into the salad. And then some of the moisture, can be drawn out from those elements in order to keep the overall salad nicely hydrated or nice and moist. So you might give that a try. And then, depending on, what you like, you can certainly add more moist items like a diced tomato, for example. But give that a try and see how you like it. Thank you. All right, next up, I'm working on shakshuka. I'm happy with my sauce, but I'm struggling how to add the raw eggs to the mixture. The egg whites take a fair amount of time to cook through, and the yolks are overcooking in the process. Can you advise? Wow. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, this is something that I experience a lot. There's just a really fine line there. Now, temperature-wise, egg whites cook at a lower temperature than egg yolks. All right, so technically you can get the egg whites to cook before the yolks, but the difference is just a few degrees. And so once the egg whites are cooked, the egg yolks tend to cook right away. And that's often when the lid is on the pot. And so there's a delicate balance that you need to strike here. Once the and it's not perfect here, but let's try this out, right? So once the egg whites are getting to that delicate point of doneness, we want to remove the lid and then serve the dish. And we want to then commence eating pretty quickly before the residual heat from the pan and all that shakshuka body, the sauce, through its carryover cooking, cooks the yolk. There's a very narrow window that you get to play with there. Okay. Now, I mean, if you wanted to modify the process, you can always poach eggs. This is really maybe more work than it's worth, but you can poach eggs so that the egg yolks are nice and soft, and then just add those on top of your shakshuka and put it out on the table. But otherwise, it becomes a very delicate balance between the time the whites are done and the egg yolks are done. But to see if you can strike that balance. All right, thank you. We are learning to cook vegetables in water, but I had heard that steaming vegetables is healthier since they supposedly retain more of the nutrients. Is that so? Arguably that is the case. I don't worry about it too much. I think it becomes more of an issue if you overcook your vegetables. Otherwise, if you want to hedge your bet ever so slightly, you might steam them instead of, simmering them. But still, I think you run into a similar issue of nutrient degradation if you overcook them in the steamer. It's probably as much or more of an issue of the degree of doneness as it is the cooking method that you choose. Okay. So yeah, I'd say flip a coin and then see whatever is most convenient, right, for the way that you like to cook. Thank you. Let's see. Next question is regarding Volrath. Okay, nonstick pans. Do you recommend aluminum or stainless steel base? Can you describe the properties of both? This is an aluminum pan. If it's nonstick, I'd buy the least expensive one and not worry too much about anything else. Your food's going to be in contact with a nonstick surface, and when it gets scratched, you'll throw it out and buy a new one. So whichever one is going to be more affordable would be the one that I reach for. But otherwise, in terms of any properties, aluminum conducts heat pretty quickly. Stainless steel, if it has a bonded base to it, often it does, a thin disc of aluminum to even out the heat distribution. That's going to be fine as well. Those, might be some things I keep an eye out for, but otherwise, not a big deal to me. All right. Let's see. Next up, we are learning. Nope, just touched on that one from Karen. Are there herbs you are not good to freeze? Totally up to your personal preference. I think, in terms of the world of herbs, you can probably freeze anything. It really just depends on how you plan to use the herb and what your personal preference is around the way it looks and how you handle it. Personal preference all the way. All right. Next up, could you recommend how to handle flax seeds after they're ground, so flavor-wise and nutrients? Okay, so flax seeds. So in terms of handling flax seeds, usually they're very simply just incorporated into some sort of preparation, whether something is quick and easy as a smoothie or pancakes. You can certainly sprinkle them onto a stir fry. It really doesn't matter. If you simply want to consume flax seeds, if you want to use flax seeds as a functional item, the gelling property of flax seeds, can be used to add structure to, maybe a plant-based pancake or a quick bread, right? Where otherwise, eggs, it might be called for. If you omit eggs, you can gel flaxseed and then incorporate that into the base to replicate some of those textural qualities of the egg, for example. But otherwise, it really is as simple as adding ground flaxseed to anything, right, to get some of the nutritional benefits offered by that food item. Now, flavor-wise, it has an earthy flavor, and so this is where you probably don't want to take a spoonful of flaxseed on its own, even if it is gelled, but instead incorporate it with something else that's going to have a more dominant flavor. Okay, and then it becomes more enjoyable. All right, thanks. All right, next question. What are the differences between all the paprikas, for example, hot, smoked, sweet? How do they achieve the smokiness? Which is the preferred for paella? Thank you for all your answers. I've been learning a lot. Excellent. I'm glad this has been helpful for you, Deborah. Very, very briefly, the differences between paprikas, hot, smoked, and sweet is just that. It's the taste. There are certainly some paprikas that are hot, right? Like chili, like red hot chili hot. Much of what we see in the North American market, for example, is without heat. It tends to be sweet, having a more noticeable capsicum or chili flavor minus the heat. The smoked product is smoked, so it's added smoky flavor. And it really runs the gamut. I mean, here in North America, generally speaking, we receive a subset of what you might find in Spain, for example. Whereas there are many more flavor nuances available within this broad spectrum of paprika, which is preferred for paella. In my experience, it's been smoked and sweet, but I don't think I've had the full array of paella either. There's probably some calling for hot paprikas as well. And so you might try them all and see what you like personally, and then consider doing some deeper research into the topic of paella, regional preferences in Spain, for example, and to see what people do in those different contexts. All right, thank you. All right, let's see here. It says, thank you for breaking down the difference between vegans and whole food plant-based and the stance on honey. Your simple explanation that whole food plant-based is a whole food plant-based diet minus the politics was spot on. Now I get it. Excellent. I'm glad that was helpful. Wow, I could talk so much more on that, but I'll leave it at that because it gets political from here. All right. Food, as I've said before, is my favorite 4-letter F word because it's can be so controversial, so divisive, yet so a way to bring us together in a very significant sort of way. All right. Says, I love debate. However, my heart always sinks when a recipe asks for a dry caramel. Unfortunately, I always burn them. I cook the caramel on a low heat and never stir. What could I be doing wrong? Okay, so caramel. So you're not stirring, so that's fine. So basically, right? Caramel is sugar and water. We were dissolving sugar in the water over heat and bringing that up to the point where it starts to brown or caramelize, right? The sugars start to alter in structure, take on different flavors, different aromas, different colors. And there's a range, that we work with here. So right around the mid range here of about 340, 345 degrees Fahrenheit, 171 to 174 degrees Celsius is going to be kind of an amber, nice, flavorful caramel that a lot of people are shooting for. Otherwise, there's a broader range of about 325 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. As we get up toward, starting out with 325, there's very little flavor. As you approach 350 and above, stronger bitter notes are introduced. And so that 340 to 345 degrees Fahrenheit window is a popular one. As you start out dissolving the sugar, make sure it's dissolved. You can stir it with a spoon. You might use your fingers to make sure that that it's smooth, so that you don't get recrystallization of the sugar. Put a lid on the pan. Let that boil, and let that temperature come up. And then as you get down the path and you remove the lid and color starts to develop, use a thermometer to see where you are within that temperature spectrum. And keep in mind that as you approach your desired temperature window, that carryover cooking will continue to push that temperature even higher. And that's often when we get into the bitterness and the burnt characteristics that we really don't want. So a couple of things to keep in mind. One, have an ice bath off to the side so you can pull the pan off the fire and immediately cool it down. The other thing is, as you're using your thermometer, is to even consider pulling it off just a smidge early, knowing that perhaps some of the carryover cooking will then push it up into your desired, window of doneness in terms of the style of caramel that you want to produce. But it'll take some practice, okay? And with practice, then you can stop using the thermometer and just go on the basis of color. And still, you want to otherwise remove it from the pan or cool the pan, or a combination of the two, so that you don't go over the temperature range. Okay, never check the temperature of caramel with your bare fingers, though, right? Because it is super duper hot and it will pull the skin off your fingertips. So always use a thermometer. All right, thank you. All right, next up, looking forward to the course. We already cook whole food plant-based, excellent. But looking forward to learning more about how to vary food textures, especially getting foods crisp. Also, how to vary calorie density from different for different family members. Okay, so yeah, great question. Food texture. And how to vary food texture is something that I'm asked about from time to time within the plant-based context of cooking. A lot of people mentioned that plant-based cooking is all mushy, for example, and certainly a lot of it is. But I think there are some ways to control it and to introduce variation and even elements of crispiness. Okay, so let's talk through some of this. Keep in mind that all of this control of texture, right, is based upon skill development. Okay, and so with more practice is going to come more refinement to your cooking. And as we cook vegetables, we have a wide range, right, from blanching, which can retain full firmness of that product, all the way to cooking to something that is very, very soft, and then points in between. So, keep in mind that you have control, or you will have control as your skill development increases. So, if we have something like, let's say, risotto, which is a fairly soft and even consistency throughout, we can introduce elements of firmness by cooking your vegetable of choice. It could be often it's a root vegetable. It could be a winter squash, to a just done degree of doneness, so it retains firmness. And then we can fold that in at the very end at service time to maximize that texture contrast, which is very pleasing on the palate. Now, in terms of other elements of texture, we can add nuts and seeds. And I usually recommend toasting nuts and seeds for added flavor. But those can be kept in their whole form, like a large piece of pecan or a walnut, or small sesame seeds. And those add beautiful textural contrast, and it could add a little bit of crispiness, but it's more of a crunch, I guess. In terms of crispiness, this is where we might get into things like croutons, or maybe other elements of say, bread, like a fattoush salad, right? Might incorporate some crispy elements of bread that start to moisten up as it sits. But there's some element of crispiness that's added. There's also garnishes. Maybe it's a crispy bread stick that you might add. Nicely caramelized crackers that can be incorporated into a dish, could be garnished on top. It could be served on the side to add, true elements of crispiness to a dish. And so the overall strategy then is going to be to prepare different components of a given dish separately. So you can apply different types of cooking methods to get the desired sort of layering of textures that you then bring together at the time of service. So that's ultimately going to be the way you control that. That's the way it's done in restaurants. That's the way you do it with catering. And that's certainly the way you can do it at home as well. But it takes a little bit more discipline and a little bit more time, perhaps. Not necessarily, but certainly some more skill around time management to get those things done simultaneously. Okay, but a little bit more practice will get you there. Now, in terms of calorie density, that's going to come, I think, with some study on your part. Just keep in mind very basically that foods that are higher in fat, right, are going to be more calorie dense. And so, we think about seeds and nuts. We think about avocados as those very mainstream ingredients that are relatively high in fat and therefore calorie density. And when we talk about calorie density, we're talking about a big difference, right? Where, a gram of fat contains more than twice as many calories as a gram of protein or carbohydrates. And so the calorie density is significant when we're consuming fat, and certainly added fat, right? If you're adding oil for cooking, using oil in dressings, any of these ways of adding oil to a dish can really sneak up on you as well if you're trying to control energy intake through fat. So keep that in mind. This is where if one is trying to lower calorie density, calorie intake, then decreasing or omitting oil can be very powerful. Now, on the other hand, you might be thinking about adding fat, right, to adding it to your body, calories, energy to your diet, in which case you can simply garnish food with nuts and with seeds, add a half an avocado, to every meal, and that'll get you there pretty quickly. All right. Thank you. All right. From Jill, I purchased garlic at a farmer's market, and it's a fresh hardneck garlic, okay, with a huge thick stalk. I'm having trouble cutting the stalk with a chef's knife. And can I use a can of stock be used to make stock? Okay. Confused, me too. Confused about how to cut open and extract cloves. Okay. So in the world of garlic, we've got soft neck garlic and hard neck garlic. Usually at the grocery store, when we pick up a head of garlic, it's soft neck garlic, right? There's, you can pull the garlic cloves off, and there's really not much in the center that's left there. You really just have garlic cloves. Hard neck garlic has a very distinctive hard stalk right up the center, and the garlic cloves are kind of built around that. And so first of all, we're just pulling the garlic cloves off of that. That's how I access that. The stock in the middle, I've never used it. I guess it depends maybe on how fresh it is. I've always had hard neck garlic, that's had a chance to dry for a while. So the stock itself is very hard, and I don't bother cutting it. I just discard it and focus on the cloves. But if you get something that's fresher, like freshly harvested, and you are interested in using the stock for stock, try to chew on it and see if there's some flavor. Ultimately, that decision is going to be yours. As I like to say, when in doubt, put it in your mouth and see how you like it. And if there's flavor, then go ahead and put it in your stock pot. If not, consider the compost bin. Okay. And yeah, I think that addresses the questions there. Thank you. And next up, tried to cook garlic scapes in oven on baking sheet with parchment, but they burned. Haven't started class yet. Will this topic be covered or do you recommend a technique? I'm new to any cooking, trying for healthy, whole food, plant-based. Okay. A garlic scape, right, is that blossom portion that comes off the top of the garlic, the nice green portion. And very often you can trim those off and eat them as a vegetable. Just cut them into whatever desired size is going to work in your dish. You can stir fry it with other things and enjoy it. They can certainly be roasted in the oven, like you might roast asparagus on a sheet pan. If something is burning, then we very simply want to decrease the cooking time and or decrease the temperature. So, fundamentally, cooking is about controlling time and temperature. And so if, you can just look at those two elements, those two variables, and either increase or decrease one or both of those to try to get to your desired outcome. And so that's where I would start with the garlic scapes. And, like asparagus, they can dry out very quickly. So you want to keep an eye on it and pull those out even before you think they're ready. And you can always do a little taste test and see how you like it at that point. You can always put them back in the oven, right? But once they're charred, there's no going back. So give that a try, Jill. Thank you. So Christine asks, does massaging kale make it more digestible? So this is an interesting question. So fundamentally, the more you manipulate a food before you swallow it, the easier it's going to be to digest. Okay, so that's one reason why we chew food rather than swallow it whole, or at least most of us, right? And so anything that additional that we do to food, any sort of mechanical processing, like blending it, refinement of foods, if we pull out fiber from food, it's going to make it more digestible. Massaging food may or may not make a difference. Depends on how much you chew it. Okay. So in other words, if you just put unmassaged kale leaves in your mouth and you chew it thoroughly, then the massaging may not make any difference. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay. Now, if you were to further break that down by, let's say, putting it in your blender and making a liquid out of the whole kale and then drinking that, okay, the fiber and everything, that's going to be easier to digest than the chewed kale. Okay, but you still have that fiber in there that's doing its work, slowing down certain digestive and metabolic processes. Okay, now let's take this one step further, and let's say you put the kale through a juicer, and you're omitting the fiber and grabbing just the juice, and you drink that. That's going to be even easier to digest. Okay, so these are different stages, and this can be applied to any sort of a fruit or vegetable in terms of an example. Okay, so where does the massaging fit in there? The massaging, I think, first and foremost, makes the kale more palatable, right? It eliminates some of that roughness and that gruffness of the kale and just makes it more enjoyable to eat. It also provides a way to introduce certain flavors, like a flavorful oil or avocado or other seasonings that you might incorporate into that massaging process. But that really just affects the edibility, the enjoyability of that product. I would argue not necessarily the digestibility, because hopefully you're chewing the kale adequately before you swallow it. Okay. Thank you. This is an interesting question. Next up, I'd like to tell friends about this class. When does the next one begin? Just off the top of my head, I don't have the start dates, but you might, let's see, either visit Rouxbe.com and see what we have listed. Didn't quite hear that, Patrick. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. We've got, okay, yes, we've got, it sounds like the rolling start that you can participate in. Okay, so you can start at a time that's going to be convenient for you. Okay, all right. So yes, Joel, please let your friend know that your friend can join at any time. All right, thank you. So Chad mentioned about restaurants he opened in Europe. Is it possible to start with an internship there? Where are they located? I don't have information just offhand on any of the restaurants that Chad was affiliated with some years ago. So I don't have any information on that. You might might reach out to Chad directly, and you can find him at Wicked Healthy. Look for him at Wicked Healthy. That's his latest project, and he might be able to answer that question for you. All right, thank you. And next up, what is sprouted wheat bread? Can it be made at home? Where would I find the recipe? If you're talking about what I'm thinking of, it's just a matter of sprouting the grain before you proceed either with the making of the dough through a grinding process, or I have seen versions of this where sprouted grain is added to the dough. So there's a couple of different variations here. And so you can certainly make it at home, right? And you might try this by the addition of some sprouted grain to bread. And you can do that by soaking grain and then allowing it to sprout and then adding it to otherwise your favorite yeast bread dough. I guess it could be a quick bread dough for that matter. But offhand, I don't have a source to recommend to you for a recipe, but you might do a Google search to see what folks are recommending in terms of a sprouted wheat bread. All right, thank you. Let's see, what kind of cookware do you prefer? So this is very similar to a question I answered earlier. And my quick response is that I don't have really a strong preference. I use a variety of cookware from clay and stone to various types of metal. And I don't have an adherence to a brand either. I use a variety of different cookware. Okay. And so you might just try, as long as it's of decent quality, I'm open to using it. And so I would recommend just experimenting, with a single piece here, a single piece there. Feel free to pick up something used, from an appropriate store. It doesn't have to be brand new, and give it a try and see how you like it. You might end up cooking some specific items in a specific dish, whereas you might use some other types of cookware for more generalized cooking. All right, but do experiment and see what you like. Thank you. Have you ever fermented garlic? And if so, any tips or comments on technique? I have not fermented garlic. I've enjoyed eating a fair amount of it, but I've never done it myself. Next question. So best overall non-stick pans, and how long do stainless steel pans last? I have a set of Cuisine bought in 1975, still going strong, except there are some blue stains inside. Okay. Let's see, best overall non-stick pans. Okay. Best overall non-stick pans, I don't know. As I mentioned earlier, I just go down to the restaurant supply store and I'll grab something that's not too expensive because I know I'm going to replace a non-stick pan after some time once it does get scratches on it. And I like to buy restaurant quality stuff. That's why I go to the restaurant supply store. You can find these things online as well. How long do stainless steel pans last? I think if you're buying stainless steel cookware, and most any other cookware besides nonstick pans, they could last a lifetime. And I'm still experimenting on does it last a lifetime. You mentioned that you have Cuisinart cookware bought in 1975. That's pretty awesome. I have a whole slew of Cuisinart cookware that I bought in the early 80s while I was in high school, back when the stuff was still made in France, and that was the thing back then. And yeah, some of it's got the blue staining, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And it works great, looks great, and will probably outlast me. All right. And so this is where I think that buying good cookware is the key, and take care of it. And certainly, I think this stuff can last a very, very long time. All right. Thank you. Do you see or know of any trends where more and more plant-based restaurants are going oil-free? Aha, this is a good question. I don't know about oil-free in terms of a trend in restaurants. There are certainly low oil and no added oil dishes. That I occasionally notice on restaurant menus. I don't. At this point, I doubt if no oil, oil-free restaurants are a trend. I can see it as a niche for sure. I can see the interest in a dish here or there on a menu, certainly. But I tell you, cooking oil-free, has its own challenges. And when you're up against the pressures of time and volume in a restaurant, it can be challenging. And adding oil when you're cooking is really a convenience, first and foremost. So at this point, again, I haven't done a study of the marketscape, but I don't recognize it as a trend. But certainly an area of niche interest that I have seen on menus, represented by standalone dishes. Okay, so maybe something to explore, right? If you're thinking about setting out in the restaurant field. All right, next. What are great ways to realistically earn an income after completing this professional program? Well, this is a wide open question. It really is. There's so many ways to earn an income through food or through some aspect of food. Okay. There's food photography. There's food consulting. There is small scale catering on a broad basis, meaning full meal sort of offerings. There's specialty like wedding cake or just sort of some sort of specialty catering. I've seen tagine catering, for example. There's opening a cafe, opening a restaurant. There's designing a retail product, that you can then sell through a grocery store, sort of an avenue. And so there are many, many ways to earn money. Keep in mind that they're probably all equally challenging, right? Don't expect to be making a living immediately. I think like probably most any other sort of a new business startup endeavor, that's going to take some time to develop the product as well as develop an audience, and then to figure out how you're going to scale it. That's always the challenge, right? Is how do I get my product or my service out to more and more people? So I just mentioned, I think, a number of great ways to realistically earn some income from food. that can be informed, right, and fueled directly by our professional courses. But then how you carry that out is going to be up to you. Okay. But do take it, as you would any other, business endeavor, right, in terms of putting together a business plan and researching the market. All right. Thank you. What's the best way to chop fresh, ripe tomatoes for a salad? I don't know if there's a best way per se. A lot of these sort of absolute questions I shy away from because there's so many ways to do it right. You can, depending on what sort of a presentation you have in mind and what sort of a salad it is, you can slice tomatoes and use that, as the first thing on the plate, and then maybe build up the salad on top of that large slice, or maybe multiple slices of tomatoes. Perhaps they're sliced as wedges, and they're able to sort of stay suspended in a hearty leaf salad in a way that looks attractive and presents in a way that gives you height on the plate, if that's important to you. You might choose smaller tomatoes that are simply cut in half, and requiring the diner to use a fork and a knife and to be more interactive with the meal. So there's some different strategies and different plate presentations and different reasons why you might cut a tomato. Okay, but those are a few ideas. I just purchased a dehydrator and a vacuum sealer to help preserve excess leftover foods not used in a recipe. Do you recommend dehydrators and vacuum sealers for various food preservations? I say if they work for you, then it's an excellent product, excellent appliance to use. I have used these things off and on over a long period of time. I currently am not using these appliances. I have found them to be very convenient. But again, if they fit your lifestyle and your way of getting through the day, right, in terms of your schedule, then by all means use this sort of technology. Keep in mind that if you're using a vacuum sealer and something goes into the freezer, that you want to label it clearly with what it is and the date that you're putting it into the freezer, so that you can exercise what we call FIFO, F-I-F-O, or first in, first out, which is a way of product rotation, so that you can use the oldest stuff first, right? And always keep that stuff moving through your inventory. Otherwise, things get lost. And then all of a sudden you find something that's a couple of years old and you don't know what to do with it, okay? But yes, by all means, consider it and see how it fits into your lifestyle. Thank you. All right. So, great. We've got some conversation going here. So Carol says, yes, I agree. So I empathize. Okay, with Doris, I agree that it takes practice. I think what will help me is to repeat a recipe over and over every week to get it down. Too many recipes to try to make for less practice, especially if you get over 60 and try new things. Okay, good. So, this is where I'll also add that, as you find a favorite preparation, call it a recipe, use that for your inspiration while you're focusing on your skill development, right? So as you know how to use a knife in different ways and how to choose and manipulate cooking methods, how to enhance seasoning and draw out flavor and layer the complexity of texture in a dish, then you don't need to go back to that recipe and follow it line by line. You just kind of use that as a point of loose inspiration. And then the rest of your knowledge and skill and creativity will take it in a direction that really suits the moment. And it's going to adapt to the specific ingredients that are in season that you have in your refrigerator or in your garden, maybe the mood that you're in, maybe the preferences of the others at the dinner table. Okay, so that you can really you can cook fluidly, and that's really the joy of cooking, right? Not being bound to a recipe, but instead you just use maybe the photograph of the recipe, maybe a couple of key ingredients of the recipe as that inspiration, and then you do the rest of the cooking, and that's what really makes cooking fun. While I appreciate the thought of making a given recipe over and over again, you don't have to do that, right? Just make it a couple of times and then start making changes to it, and then you own it. And then you can run with it in any direction you want. Okay? Thank you. All right, so I took this course 5 years ago. May I retake it as a refresher? I'm back to whole food plant-based eating again. Now G-free, gluten-free, I'm guessing. So yeah, I mean, contact our student support folks and take up this question with them, right, in terms of approaching the course again. Okay, thank you. Could you share the brand of knives you prefer to work with, as well as the cookware? So this is kind of an echo here today regarding my preference of cookware. First of all, I don't have a preference of cookware, and I don't have a preference of knives either. Kind of like the eclectic sample of cookware that I shared earlier in today's program. We've got knives. Coming out our ears of all brands and all styles and all materials as well. So I've got Japanese knives, high carbon steel. I've got stainless steel, Japanese style knives. I've got European style knives. Let's see, I've got ceramic knives. And big knives, little knives, specific knives, specific to a task, like a bird's beak knife, which I use only for tourneing root vegetables. But I have no allegiance to a given brand. And so we've got lots and lots of different knives. And it's, if you're working with some decent quality tools, then I think your skills really take you down the path. Now, if you're in the mood, right, and you want to drop a lot of money on some really good equipment, that's fine. But then work on your skills so you can grow into your equipment. Okay. But otherwise, just get some decent stuff and develop your skills. Again, if you find a good deal on something used, pick it up. If it's a knife and it's dull as the dickens, right, you can always sharpen it, and then you have a brand new knife, essentially. Just like cookware, if it's going to be of good quality, you can clean it up, you can re-season cast iron, and you have a like new pan. So in that way, you can have a lot of fun finding some really good deals out there on the used cooking tools and equipment market. All right, thank you. I'm curious, what is the difference between the Maillard reaction and caramelization? This is a much deeper sort of a question than I'm prepared to go into, but very quickly, caramelization focuses on sugar, whereas the Maillard reaction is a combination of proteins and the sugars that are changing in their structure. And then what we see is color, aroma, flavor change. Okay, so the Maillard reaction is a little bit more complex, than caramelization. And typically, what we're seeing as we cook food, like baking bread or cooking something else, is a combination actually of Maillard reaction and caramelization. Okay, but there's whole dissertations on that if you look online. All right, very interesting stuff. Thank you. Let's see. David asks, is spinning greens necessary to make a good salad? So the purpose for a salad spinner and spinning greens is really to extract water after you've cleaned the components. And so if you find that your salad seems a little wet because of the residual water on the leaves or the other vegetable components, Maybe the salad dressing is getting a little bit watered down because of the excess water clinging to the vegetable components. Then consider spinning to extract the water. I recommend spinning as a two-step process. So get in there and spin, get most of that water off, take the lid off, and then just loosen up, fluff up everything in there, put the lid back on and spin it a second time, and you'll get most all the time a second extraction, which will leave a nice dry product that's ready for dressings or a nice presentation without any runniness at the edges. Okay, thank you. So in what foods or recipes would you use olive oil, avocado oil, or grapeseed oil? We eat whole WWPB. I'm guessing that's whole foods in some way, plant-based meals. So we use oils sparingly. How long do these oils last in the pantry, or do you recommend refrigeration? Okay, so between olive oil, avocado oil, and grapeseed oil, I say it's totally personal preference. Okay, the things that I would consider will be flavor, and whether I like the flavor or if I want the additional flavor or not, as well as the smoke point and how I will use the oil. Okay, so we talked about smoke point earlier, and your considerations around how high heat cooking you might do, stir frying or sautéing versus something at the lower end of the heat spectrum. But otherwise, personal preference, not a big deal to me. How long do these oils last in the pantry? Depends on how refined it is. Again, just to echo a little bit of what I talked about earlier, the less refined an oil is, the more stuff it has in suspension, and therefore the shorter the shelf life. Something that's going to be more refined is going to have a longer shelf life and otherwise be more stable under temperature fluctuations. So if you have something that, like a good quality olive oil, first of all, I would recommend using it. Consider olive oil a seasonal food, which it truly is. And then cooling it in a relatively, or storing it in a cool place. And if you're in a hot climate, then consider storing it in the refrigerator. Olive oils can get a little bit clumpy and cloudy when they get cold. Just know that those will thin out as the temperature rises as you are cooking. Okay. So if you find your oil is going rancid before you use them, then certainly find a cooler place, which might be the refrigerator. Okay. And next up, I went through the course syllabus to see what kind of ingredients will be needed for the course. Is it possible to use, for instance, date paste or date sugar for recipe instead of dates itself? What is alkalized cocoa powder? Okay, so let's see here. In terms of a sweetener, right? If we're talking about dates as a sweetener, absolutely, you can choose any sort of a sweetener that you might like. In terms of sweetness, right? There are some cases when we want to look at the functionality of the food. So does the food add structure, for example? Does it add a binding quality, right? In which case, you might be directed toward a more specific version of that food item. But in terms of a sweetener, most anything can be used that satisfies your palate. What's an alkalized cocoa powder? It's another word is Dutched cocoa. It's a processing step that some cocoa can go through. And I don't have a whole lot of other details to add here, but it's you can take a look, I guess, on if you want to look at some more information on that. Okay. Let's see. Next up, recipe calls for smoked tofu. Store didn't have any. Okay, is there a way to use regular tofu, maybe additional seasonings? Yeah, so you can certainly just use regular tofu and kind of forget about the smoky aspect. That's often not a problem. Depending on how you're preparing it, I have used smoked paprika to add smokiness. Now it adds color and a different sort of characteristic to the finished dish. So think about that. Depending on what you're producing, you can add chipotle. Chipotle is jalapenos that are smoked, so it has a smoky flavor. It comes with heat, so you want to think about whether you want that accompaniment or not. Also, black cardamom is a variety of cardamom spice, right? That has been dried over an open fire, so it has a distinctive smoky flavor to it. And so you can add some of that if you want a little bit of smokiness, but it also comes with a flavor of cardamom. So, you get to weigh what you like and what you want. You can always add liquid smoke or consider some ways of smoking the tofu, as I discussed earlier in today's program. Okay, thank you. All right, next up. Is there a due date for the Egg Foundation's egg functionality courses, or can I take these at my own pace? At this point, to the best of my knowledge, you can take them at your own pace. All right. And next up, what if I can't find certain ingredients such as chestnut flour? Is there a substitute for that? There might be, right? I guess it depends on what we're talking about here. I've made chestnut bread where if I were to substitute with a different item, I'd have to change the name of the bread too. Not a big deal, right? But sometimes substitutions result in very big changes to the end product. On the other hand, I've also used chestnut flour where it was a secondary item, a secondary flour, and it really didn't make any difference how I substituted it. Okay, so you bet there will be a substitution, I'm sure, for the chestnut flour, okay, or the chestnut name. All right, next up, when baking or making something using flour, how important is it to use specific flour, such as pastry flour? What should you do if you can't get anything other than all-purpose flour at your local store? Does it depend upon what you're doing? The quick answer is, yes, it depends on what you're making, but it also depends on your preference, just how finicky you want to be with the end product. Okay. Now, as we look at these different types of flour, one of the big differences is the amount of protein in the flour. And so when we think about protein in flour, we're talking about gluten. And we're talking about gluten, we're talking about the structure that results in the finished product. And something like, pastry flour would have, less gluten than AP flour, typically. And so the end product is going to be more tender. Okay. So it might be equally delicious and satisfying in other ways, but there might be a slight texture difference. So it depends on whether you can live with that, or if you really want to replicate what you experienced at your corner bakery. And so that's kind of the difference that you're going to find in the results when we use different flour. Okay. And so at the opposite end of that spectrum, if we're talking about a nice chewy loaf of bread, like a baguette, that might call for some sort of a bread flour that has a higher gluten flour. And what you're working with is AP flour or pastry flour, then you're going to have less structure, less chewiness than what you would have with that higher gluten flour. So, again, it might be a great smelling loaf of bread. It might taste great once you smear the jam on it, but it might not have that chew, right, that you expect from the baguette. And so the texture is going to be a little bit different. Okay, I hope that helps you understand. Thank you. Any dry yeast without additives you can recommend? Offhand, no. I am definitely not up to speed on yeast additives. All right, thank you. Let's see, advice please on a countertop blender or food processor. Looking at Vitamix, which almost calls for a second mortgage, less expensive alternatives that you can recommend. So, in terms of a blender, I'll separate blenders and food processors here. In terms of blenders, most of my experience is with a Vitamix or a Blend Tech. These are different companies, and their products perform at a very similar level. So you might take a look at those two companies and see if there's some comparison that might lean you toward one or the other in terms of price. Otherwise, if you can afford to get a Vitamix or a Blend Tech, or if there's something else out there that performs at an equivalent level that I'm unfamiliar with, please do consider it, because in my opinion, it makes a big difference in the kitchen. The results that you get from a Blend Tech or a Vitamix versus so many other, I'll say, conventional blenders can be very, very different. Now, the penalty is the price that you pay. And so it just kind of depends on whether, you want to kind of grin and bear it and enjoy the cooking, that's going to result from that. All right. Now, when it comes to a food processor, very often a food processor should be considered separately, right, from a blender. They overlap to some extent, but they don't do 100% of the same sorts of things. A food processor tends to be much better with thicker, pastier items, hummus, for example, perhaps nut butters. Versus thinner things like nut milks or smoothies in a blender. So it depends on what sort of cooking, right, you anticipate doing, as to which one you might buy first, keeping in mind that eventually you might end up with both of them. I certainly prefer to have both of them in my kitchen because there's a lot of overlap that's not covered, right, by the overlap, I should say. Okay. And less expensive alternatives, again, I'm not aware of them, but that's not to say that there isn't something out there. Okay. Thank you. Next up, what would you use tomato broth for? Tomato broth. Wow, I haven't used tomato broth in a long time. I would consider using tomato broth for a very light soup, even a chilled soup. I would even consider it for a beverage, either hot or cold. That's got a savory leaning to it. It might be something that I incorporate spices, into. That could be a part of a morning tonic. But tomato broth is not something that that I make very often at all. All right. Next question. We really enjoy non-dairy milk, but I don't feel quite comfortable with the elaboration in the Vitamix blender. The milk tastes like water. How can I approach it to a more tasteful and creamy consistency? Okay. So non-dairy milks. Okay, I'll preface all this by saying just very briefly, in our live event archives, there's a focus on nut milks that you might take a look at just for some fun. But otherwise, if your product is coming out water-like in flavor, then consider a couple things. You want to consider the base ingredients, okay, and lean towards something that's got a little more fat in it, okay? So, for example, rice milk tends to be very thin, whereas Walnut milk tends to be much more rich in flavor. It has a lot more fat. Okay, so that's going to be one differentiating factor. Another thing to consider is you can toast your ingredients before you make the milk. So whether it's sesame seeds or walnuts or whatever it is that you're going to grind, cashews or whatever, if you toast them and get them a little caramely, right, in color, which means also aroma and flavor, that's going to carry through to a richer nut milk. Now, you got to think about whether you want that sort of flavor intensity in your nut milk, depending on how you use it or just what you enjoy. But that's going to be an option as well. And then another thing to consider is to just add more of it to your to the bowl of the blender, right? So you have more concentration of flavor from that base ingredient. And then a fourth consideration is whether to strain it or not. Okay. And then also the coarseness or the fineness of your strainer. Because the more pulp that you pull out, the more sort of flavor you're pulling out as well. But the result is you've got a smoother and one might argue a more enjoyable nut milk on the palate. So it depends again on what you prefer personally, but also how you will use that end product. Okay, but those are some things to consider. And I see that Patrick just posted a link to the old live event that focuses on nut milks. Okay, but certainly I think a big advantage if you make nut milk at home. The quality is superior to what you will buy in the store. All right, thank you. And next up, can I make yogurt with soy milk and almond milk? Thank you. The quick answer is yes. And while I haven't made yogurt with these two products, you'll certainly see some facsimiles of these on the market. It's certainly going to be possible. I don't have the steps off the top of my head, but there's a lot of information online on injecting starters and working with yogurts that are made from these different base ingredients. All right, thank you. And let's see the next question. If a recipe calls for bread flour, you only get all-purpose flour, can you just add some gluten, I'm guessing, right? To it to use it as a substitute, and will it have the same function as the bread flour, or does the commercially sold bread flour have any more additives? So this is going to be a very technical sort of question here. So, I mean, the quick answer is yes. If you want to just add the gluten flour, the gluten powder that you can buy, you can bring up gluten content in other flours. How much you add is going to entail a little more sort of mathematical calculation in order to get to an equivalent, or I should say the same quantity or whatever your target might be. So it's kind of a nuanced question there. And then the next part of your question is, do commercially sold bread flours have any more additives? Some of them do. It all depends on the flour and the company, the processor. Okay, there are many different ways to handle flour. They have conditioners added to them to, enhance structure and to do different things. And so this gets to be a more complex sort of a question. So the first thing to do perhaps is to drill down with your brand of flour that you're using to figure out what's in it, and you can start to go from there. Okay. But yeah, this gets into some advanced sort of baking questions. Thank you. All right, next up, about substituting. So wild mushrooms looked awful at the store, so I purchased regular ones. The same went with shallots. Could I substitute red and white onion in place of shallots? I would say yes, you can. That's the quick answer. Again, knowing that any substitution that we make will create an end product that's a little bit different than what was intended by the recipe. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that, so long as you like the end product. Okay, so in terms of shallots, if you're happy with using red onions or white onions or yellow onions or something else, then go for it. That's going to be quite fine. Okay. So from Patricia again, so made vegetable stock for pho the other day, and of course have leftover stock making cashew bechamel today. Would the stock be useful, or is the spice combination not compatible? I think it's all up to your palate, okay, and what you will use that bechamel in, okay. If the spice, the flavoring from the broth will carry through the bechamel into the final dish where you will have sort of a spicy profile, then that could be perfect, right? But if you're just thinking about a very simple mac and cheese, or if your audience is expecting that, then using the spicy broth or stock may be a surprise that they don't like. On the other hand, it might be a surprise that they do like, right? So, keep those things in mind as you make that decision. All right, thank you. Let's see. Sarah asks, any tips on how to care for wooden utensils? Okay, so, my approach for wooden utensils is to basically clean them and dry them as quickly as I can after using them. I don't like to soak them in the sink unless there's some specific reason that calls for that. I don't like to put them in the dishwasher. I just clean them and at least pat them dry as quickly as I can and let them further air dry after that, just as soon as I can. All right, I hope that's helpful for you. And that brings us to the end of today's program. And gosh, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me today, whether you came in from the very first second or whether you joined today's program midstream. Thank you so much for your participation and your engagement. And as I mentioned early on in the show, if you have any other questions, feel free to send those in to support@rouxbe.com, and I would be happy to answer those questions for you. All right. Until next time, enjoy cooking. Thank you. Bye-bye.